We need to talk about Luffy and Roger, and why your brain has filed them under same goofy pirate, different hat. You know exactly the take, I mean. Oda just likes drawing parallels. It's vibes, it's wholesome. They're both silly D-guys who laugh at death and inspire people. And listen to me, that reading is comfortable. It's cute. It's also flattening one of the sharpest pieces of engineering in this entire story. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you see those side-by-side panels of Roger and Luffy smiling on the scaffold, or the crew crying while their idiot captain laughs at some impossible dream, you probably hit like repost and move on. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because Oda is not just doing or, history repeats. He is showing you a blueprint being run twice. Here's the thing. Roger and Luffy are not duplicates. They're a two-stage system test. Roger is the prototype who mapped the world-scale mechanism built in the Void Century. Luffy is the final user, the one born into a timeline where that system can actually be turned on, altered, or destroyed. Same route, different function, same smile, different outcome. Rayleigh literally tells you this. He looks at the Straw Hats, remembers sailing with Roger, and goes, "Your journey is almost identical to ours," and then refuses to spoil the answers. The fandom reaction is, "Wow, that's neat trivia." No. That is Oda standing in the middle of the page, waving a giant sign that says, "I built one rote and I'm running it twice to show you what changed in the world, in the weapons, and in the person pressing the button." Because if this blueprint reading is right, every fun parallel suddenly has teeth. Roger laughing at the true history on Laugh Tale. Luffy laughing when he tells his crew the real dream behind becoming Pirate King. And they react the same way Odin did to Roger. Those aren't just D people are weird. Those are structural hints about Joy Boy, about an ancient weaponized system, about the One Piece as something closer to a master control node than a chest of gold, and the wholesome fandom edit of Roger and Luffy laughing at the final secret. When you line those panels up and actually take the Void Century genocide, the ancient weapons, and the Red Line seriously, that scene stops being cute. It becomes horrifying. What kind of person laughs when they realize the world can literally be rewritten? Not because I'm smarter than you, but because my brain is broken in a very specific pattern-seeking way, I want to walk you through this properly. Chronologically, we're going to track every major Roger-Luffy parallel from East Blue to Wano. Not as trivia, but as engineering diagrams for Oda's endgame system. By the time we're done, Luffy is just like Roger, won't feel comforting anymore. It'll feel like a loaded gun being passed down the generations. So let's start at the beginning of the route Roger drew, and the first place Luffy quietly corrects him. The comfortable lie. It's just parallels, bro. And here's where the fandom slams the brakes. You've seen the edits. Split screen, Roger and Luffy. Same grin, same pose, same camera angle. Maybe it's Loguetown execution stand versus Marineford. Maybe it's them laughing with their crews, slapped over a TikTok audio that goes, "Oda just loves parallels." You get the side-by-side panels, the little sparkle effects, maybe a caption like "Father and Son Energy." It's cute, it's clean, it's safe. And listen to me, that safe reading has basically become the dominant religion. You've got YouTube comps that are just Roger/Luffy moments back to back with no commentary, like we're watching an aesthetic mood board instead of a 25-year war document. People treat Oda loves parallels like it's an answer. It's not an answer, it's a screensaver. Because here's the thing, those same smiling faces exist in a story that also contains the Void Century genocide, 3 ancient weapons that can erase islands, Fishman Island's literal prophesied destruction, and a shadow monarch who points at Lelouchia on a map and deletes it from history. You cannot, with a straight face, tell me this is just vibes. This is not a scrapbook. This is a crime scene. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When you say, they're just parallels, what you usually mean is, I don't want to think about what it means that Luffy is retracing the exact path of a man who reached the end of the world, read the true history, and failed to save it. Calling it fan service lets you enjoy the treasure hunt without asking what happens when the hunt ends at a weapon panel instead of a chest of gold. And I say that with love, because my brain does the same thing. It wants to freeze on the frame where Kid Roger and Kid Luffy both declare they'll be Pirate King and go, wow, poetry. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. It flattens inherited will into a Pinterest board. Oda does not reward that kind of flattening. He punishes it. Skypiea was dismissed as filler for years, and yet that arc is the first time we see a poneglyph ringing an actual bell to broadcast the Void Century to the sky. Dressrosa looked like goofy toy gags until you realize the toys are literally people erased from memory in a systemic slavery metaphor. When you line those panels up, the pattern is brutal. If something is big, repeated, and expensive to draw, it is never just for fun at this scale. So if we stop treating the Luffy-Roger parallels as Easter eggs and start treating them as a design document, the entire endgame of One Piece tilts. Roger's route stops being a cute echo and becomes a failed prototype. Luffy's journey stops being like Roger's and becomes a live attempt to debug it, which raises the real question. Where exactly has Oda shown Luffy stepping into Roger's footprints and quietly changing the outcome? Why I'm this insane about parallels and why you should be too. Which raises the real question. Where exactly has Oda shown Luffy stepping into Roger's footprints and quietly changing the outcome? Here's the thing. I did not answer that like a normal human being. A normal person rereads Loguetown to enjoy the execution stand tension. I reread Loguetown with a notebook, pausing every 3 panels like, okay, where is the camera when Luffy's head is on the block versus when Roger's was? And what does that say about inherited will as a system variable? My brain is broken in a very specific pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast whey and Oda keeps feeding it. Skypiea, you saw a fun ancient sky island and Enel's goofy moonship. I saw a test server for the Void Century network and went frame by frame through the Shandora poneglyph, cross-checking Odin's flashback and Roger's laugh tale. Because when you line those panels up, the composition is screaming, this is the same joke at half volume. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Who rereads Sabaody just to map which supernova panels mirror Roger's era wanted posters? Me. It's me. And I say that with love. By the time I hit Fishman Island, I wasn't reading a story. I was running a forensic audit. Dialogue callbacks, chapter titles, Rayleigh's wording in that bar, Whitebeard's Marineford speech, Odin's journal entries, even those cursed cover stories everyone skims. If Oda put ink on it, I treated it like evidence. Egghead drops a line about ancient energy. That goes on the same corkboard as Skypiea's Golden Bell and Wano's Sea Level Prophecy. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend these echoes are random. Listen to me, I am not doing this because I think I can solve One Piece before chapter 1200. I'm doing it because if you assume Oda writes like a meticulous engineer, reusing structures, stress testing ideas across arcs, building a scaffold under the chaos, and then you push that assumption until it breaks, you learn where the real design is. Not because I am smarter than you, I am dangerous because I'm stubborn. I will happily reread Wano's flashbacks 10 times just to see whether Toki's prophecy syntax matches the way Roger talks about being too early. So I'm not up in some ivory tower of galaxy brain takes. I'm in the trenches with you, drowning in tabs, yelling about Rayleigh refusing to spoil the history because he knows the route Luffy is walking is almost exactly Roger's, just under different conditions. We're all staring at the same panels. I'm just the one deranged enough to print out the cover stories and draw arrows between them like a conspiracy theorist whose only religion is panel composition. Here's how we're going to use that insanity. First, I'm going to map Luffy's journey onto Roger's chronologically, East Blue through Loguetown, Skypiea, Sabaody, Fishman Island, Wano, Egghead, and show you where the footprints overlap and where they deliberately slip. Then we escalate. We're going to treat those parallels as a system diagram. What Roger reached, what he refused to trigger, and what Luffy is being engineered by the story to actually press. And if that sounds excessive, good. Because once you see how tight the blueprint is, you won't be able to go back to Roger was just early and the One Piece is funny treasure ever again. From treasure chest to operating system, what the One Piece actually is. So if Roger is the draft run and Luffy is the revision, we need to talk about the thing they're both orbiting. Because the second you say, hey, the One Piece is just treasure and a big party, you are not reading the same story Oda is drawing. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Does a gag chest justify erasing an entire century of history from the planet? Does a goofy punchline require 3 doomsday weapons named after gods, a genocide in O'Hara, and Vegapunk literally saying the seas themselves might change? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Look at the pattern. The Void Century isn't just redacted, it's actively hunted. The Ancient Kingdom didn't just have cool boats. They had sun-powered super tech that scares a government that already controls Buster Calls, Seraphim, and whatever Emu is doing to whole islands. Pluton is buried under Wano. Poseidon is a living princess who commands Sea Kings. Uranus is implied to be a sky-based planet cracker. None of that escalates this hard, just to reveal haha gold on Loguetown. Here's the thing. The story is already speaking the language of systems. The Void Century is the version history. The Ancient Kingdom is the original developer. The ancient weapons are hardware modules. The Poneglyph network is a distributed database logging coordinates, specs, and a user manual in dead stone, so it can't be patched out. The One Piece is not another shiny component on the shelf. It's the operating system tying the whole thing together. When you line those panels up, from Robin reading weapon blueprints in Alabasta, to Skypiea's poneglyph handing off Poseidon's location, to Zoo and Wano mapping out a route, you don't get a treasure hunt, you get an access protocol. Roger, through Odin, literally writes new data onto the Shandora stone. He's updating the system for the next user. So why doesn't he boot it up himself? Too early for what? Listen to me. At Loguetown, Roger clearly accesses the full stack. True history, Joy Boy's failure, the intended joke ending. But Poseidon isn't awakened yet. Shirahoshi won't be born for decades. Wano is sealed, so Pluton is offline. The alliances across Fishman Island, Wano, Alabasta, Zoo, not formed. The system is missing critical modules, and the operator is a dying man with no inherited network. That's why his execution is a broadcast, not a farewell. He's seeding an era designed to produce the right user. Enter Luffy. Same initial dream reaction as Roger. Same laugh in the face of impossible history, but placed in an era where Shirahoshi exists, Momonosuke can command Zunesha, and the Straw Hats have physically touched almost every major poneglyph cluster. His rubber body, his mythical fruit, is literally described as a liberation god. That's not just narrative poetry, that's UI design. He is the interface the system was waiting for. And not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is rude. The Luffy-Roger parallels start to look less like vibes and more like a blueprint for a second attempt. First captain discovers the OS and walks away. Second captain arrives when every subsystem is online. The real question is, what happens when someone who hates control is handed root access to a planet-scale weaponized operating system? We were too early. The line. Everyone underestimates. So when Roger gets handed that root access and says no, we need to talk about the line, everybody turns into a Tumblr mood board instead of a diagnosis. Odin's flashback. Roger and his crew finally reach Loguetown. They read the true history, they see Joy Boy's ancient prank, and they just lose it. This whole crew of killers and legends crying with laughter at the biggest secret in the world. Then Odin narrates Roger's verdict. We were too early. Not we failed, not we weren't worthy. Too early. And the fandom immediately goes, "Awe, tragic, romantic. They were born in the wrong era." Cue the AMV edits with swelling music and star fields while Roger's ship fades into sepia. I've watched those. You've watched those. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because too early is not a vibe. It's a time code. It implies a schedule, a window, a set of conditions that have to be met before the One Piece system can actually fire. You don't say we were too early about a chest of treasure. You say it about a launch sequence that aborts at T-10 because half the modules are still red. Here's the thing. If you take the canon seriously, Void Century, Prophecy, Ancient Weapons, Poseidon being literally born on a timetable, then Roger's line stops being wistful and starts being technical. It's him standing in the control room of a planet-scale weapon and going, "Okay, Joy Boy left the OS, the manuals, the poneglyph network, but the hardware isn't fully online yet. Fishman Island Alliance, not secured. Poseidon, not awakened. Pluton, still sealed in a closed Wano. World government resistance, not primed. Too early for what? Listen to me. Too early to actually execute the world rewrite the ancient kingdom designed. Too early to knock down the red line, flood the seas, move Fishman Island to the surface, and force every power structure to reboot. When you line those panels up, Roger is not sighing about fate. He's filing a bug report. And I say that with love. We flatten this because the darker version is uncomfortable. If Roger could have done it and chose not to, then his execution speech is not a romantic last laugh. It's a recruitment ad. My treasure? It's yours if you can find it. Translation. I've mapped the system. I've tested the inputs. I know the constraints. Someone else has to press the button. Which is exactly where Luffy walks in. Roger identifies the blueprint, stress tests the world, and then deliberately leaves the job to a future user who will arrive at the right moment with the right keys. A born Poseidon, an open Wano, a generation raised in the Great Pirate era he himself ignited. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is rude. That line is the hinge between their stories. Roger is the engineer who refuses to deploy to production. Luffy is the guy who's going to log in when every subsystem is finally green. The real question is, when Luffy reaches that same room and hears the same joke, does he laugh the same way, or does he do the one thing Roger wouldn't? Laughing at the end of the world, joy, horror, or both. So let's go to the place where that question already has an answer, because Oda showed us the prototype. Roger did reach that room. He did hear the joke. And what he did first was not scream, not kneel, not deliver a stirring speech about freedom. He laughed. We need to talk about how wrong that laugh feels if you stop letting the anime music carry you. The Roger Pirates hit Laugh Tale. They read 800 years of Void Century genocide, ancient weapons, Joy Boy's apology, the entire world's history carved in stone. Odin's there, Rayleigh's there, these are not idiots. And their response, when you line those panels up, is this full-body, tears in their eyes hysteria at how ridiculous it all is. Joy Boy, I wish I'd lived in your era. We were too early. Let's call this island Laugh Tale. That is not the behavior of a man who just found a quirky treasure chest and a goofy prank. That's a guy staring at a system so big, so cruel, and so elegantly stupid that the only human reaction left is to break into laughter before you break entirely. Now mirror that with Luffy's ridiculous dream scene. The one Oda literally mutes. The captain says the real dream, the one beyond Pirate King, and the crew's reactions are the same cocktail. Shock, tears, huge grins, people calling him insane while also loving him more for it. You do not hide that dialogue bubble unless it is the same category of information as Laugh Tale itself, an answer that recontextualizes the whole story too early. Here's the thing. The comfy fandom take is, they're just silly guys who love freedom. They laugh at everything. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. You don't laugh like that at a normal dream. You laugh like that when someone looks at an unbearable, absurd responsibility and says with a straight face, "Yeah, I'm going to do this anyway." I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If the One Piece is a world-scale weaponized system, a literal control panel for the sea and sky, then the final joke is not a punchline, it's a design document. Roger reads the spec sheet for planetary restructuring and laughs because the only way to stay sane is to frame this horror as a gag. Luffy declares a dream that only makes sense if he's planning to press that same button and then somehow make it fun. That's where the will of D stops being "they smile when they die" and becomes they can emotionally metabolize cosmic level horror and still choose joy and action. It's not just a quirky death grin, it's a neurological setting. Laugh instead of freeze. Move instead of despair. And listen to me, not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda is rude. If both Roger and Luffy can laugh at the same final joke, the real fracture point isn't whether they understand it. It's why one of them walked away from the console. So the next question is obvious. What is different about Luffy's laugh that might actually let him pull the trigger on a system Roger refused to touch? Inherited Will 101. Not a vibe, a transmission protocol. The answer is protocol. Luffy's laugh is running on a different operating system than Roger's, and Oda has been showing you the installation process for 25 years. We need to talk about Inherited Will, because fandom treats it like a horoscope. Dreams never die, Nakama, in our hearts. You've seen the edits. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. In the story, Inherited Will is never just vibes. Whitebeard doesn't die going, "Believe in yourself." He dies literally declaring the existence of One Piece, calling out the government and handing the next generation a to-do list. Find the treasure, trigger the war, overturn the era. Corazon doesn't pass Law a mood, he passes him a mission and a devil fruit. Tom doesn't give Frankie shipwright energy, he gives him blueprints, charges him to build a ship that will cross the world, and makes him answer for the sea train. Oden doesn't tell Momonosuke, "Live free, my son." He says, "Open Wano, unseal the border, finish the job I failed to complete. These are tickets at a deli counter, numbers, tasks in a queue." So when Whitebeard remembers Roger talking about the man who will find One Piece, listen to me, that's not a prophecy, that's a work order. Roger is explicitly defining a successor user for the system he discovered. Then Shanks walks around with Roger's hat for years and does the most suspicious thing in the entire story. He gives it to a random East Blue kid along with a promise. That hat is not just sentiment, it's a physical token of transfer, a literal key that says, "You're the one who's going to the console." Here's the thing, once you stop treating Inherited Will as magic bloodline feelings and start treating it like a relay race, the structure snaps into focus. Roger runs first leg, finds the Void Century truth, maps the poneglyph network, confirms the weaponized nature of the treasure, realizes it's too early. Shanks runs second, safeguards information, nudges the balance at Marineford, protects specific pieces on the board. Luffy is third leg and anchor, the designated system operator whose job is to actually execute or dismantle what's waiting on that final island. And that D-smile? That's not a quirky family trait, it's a shared protocol for how you face the system's backlash without folding. Roger walks to his execution grinning. Ace dies smiling in his brother's arms. Saul laughs in O'Hara's flames. Luffy at Marineford and in every near-death meets catastrophe with that same feral joy. It's not recklessness, it's training for the moment you stand in front of a world-scale weapon and accept the cost. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Does any of that sound like the next Roger? No. Luffy is not a remake. He's the planned sequel. Roger spends his last years seeding an era, updating poneglyphs, and literally telling Rayleigh, don't guide them. because the system needs an operator who arrives with his own answers, not Roger's. When you line those panels up, you don't get a legend being replaced. You get an ancient blueprint waiting for the one idiot brave enough to press the button. So the real question isn't, will Luffy surpass Roger? It's, what does an inherited operating manual actually tell him to do once he boots the thing? Blueprint versus copy. Why Luffy isn't Roger 2.0? So if Roger hands Luffy the operating manual, we need to talk about why that does not mean Roger respawned with a gacha re-roll. Because I need you to be very honest with me for a second. The Luffy is just Roger 2.0 take is comfy. It's simple. It's also flattening the entire story. On the surface, yeah, Oda is screaming, compare them. Same straw hat lineage, literally past Roger to Shanks to Luffy like a cursed save file. Same stupidly bright grin in the face of execution, disease, sea kings, you name it. Same reflex to laugh at danger so hard that everyone around them either signs up for the insanity or gets dragged along anyway. Roger laughs at the true history, Luffy laughs at his ridiculous dream, and the people in the room cry, then smile, then swear their lives. Their dreams are contagious, their stupidity is a pandemic. But here's the thing. Once you get past the grin, the structure of their journeys is completely different. Roger is on a timer, terminal illness, blood in the handkerchief, the whole tragic captain archetype. He reaches the void century truth knowing he is physically done. Luffy? He's made of rubber and narrative plot armor. His clock is external, bounties, emperors, emu, not his own body giving out. Roger also only unlocks the voice of all things late. He's already a monster before he can hear sea kings and poneglyphs. Luffy is hearing sea kings at age 7 on a random sea king taxi with Shanks, then hearing Zunesha in the middle of a war. That's not a flavor detail. That's Oda giving the system's future operator a much longer calibration period. And look at the allies. Roger never has Poseidon awakened. Shirahoshi isn't born. Wano is closed. Pluton is buried. The Kozuki are half broken. Whitebeard respects Roger, but will not move for his dream. Luffy walks into Fishman Island and literally promises to destroy Fishman Island after befriending Poseidon. He liberates Wano, earns Momonosuke, Hiyori, the Scabbards, and a country that wants him to win. When you line those panels up, you don't see a copy, you see missing pieces being filled in. Oda is using the mirroring as a highlighter, not a photocopier. Same island names, same laugh at the impossible, same Rayleigh going, your route is eerily familiar, and then refusing to spoil anything. But the real point is where Luffy diverges, where he saves people Roger couldn't, where he refuses crowns Roger might have worn for a second, where he builds a coalition that actually contains all 3 ancient weapons instead of just knowing they exist. Think of Roger as the blueprint phase and Luffy as the construction phase. Roger walks the world, stress tests the foundations, marks the fault lines in history, and writes notes on the walls in indestructible stone. Luffy shows up decades later with better materials, better timing, and workers who actually know what they're building. And we're not staying theoretical. Next, I'm going to walk you through arc by arc, Skypiea, Sabaody, Fishman Island, Wano, and show you exactly where Luffy steps into Roger's footprints and where he deliberately stomps off the path. The scary part is what those corrections add up to. East Blue as Roger's ghost. The origin route you missed. So if later arcs are the skyscraper, we need to talk about the foundation Oda poured in the kiddie pool. East Blue is marketed to you as the weakest sea. That's the meme, right? Tutorial Island, low-level mobs, relax your brain. Listen to me. In the actual story logic, East Blue is a quarantine test chamber where Roger's ghost is being contained. Look at who is parked there. Garp, Shanks, Makino. The world government base that just so happens to be close enough for Kobe's little hero fantasy. This is not random. This is a controlled environment around the child of the man Garp once hunted and secretly respected, and the apprentice of that same man who just casually shows up with the exact hat and the exact fruit that will drag this kid into the ancient history weapon plot. East Blue is weak, is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because what Oda is doing is giving Luffy the same kind of early route Roger had, just under surveillance. Roger meets Rayleigh when Rayleigh is literally homeless on a stolen boat, drifting with nothing. Luffy meets Zoro tied to a post, starved, left to die as an example. Both captains walk up to someone broken and cornered and go, "Come with me." Different framing, same recruitment algorithm. Run that pattern again. Nami is a thief trapped under Arlong's boot, selling her soul to buy back her village. Usopp is the liar no one believes, abandoned by pirates and by his own reputation. Sanji is a cook starving on a rock, whose entire life is one man's guilt. When you line those panels up with what little we know of the early Roger crew, Rayleigh the Drifter, Scopper and the rest betting their lives on a nobody captain, you see the same magnetism. Roger and Luffy don't recruit resumes, they recruit despair and turn it into belief. Now add Garp as the shared marine shadow. This is the man who chased Roger to the ends of the earth, traded blows with him, and still accepted his last request about Ace. That same man raises Luffy in East Blue and keeps trying to stuff him into a marine uniform. On paper, that's comedy. In the blueprint, that's containment protocol. If he can't stop the inherited will, maybe he can box it into the system that hunts pirates instead of becoming the pirate that reaches the One Piece. And then there's Loguetown. The town of the beginning and the end is not subtle. This is where Roger's public story ends and where Luffy's public story actually begins. Execution platform, storm, dragon, the whole world watching a nobody declare he'll be Pirate King at the same scaffold where the last one smiled. Too on the nose? Yes, that's the point. Oda is stapling the eras together in one square of East Blue real estate. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Do you really think it's an accident that the sea where Roger was born, hunted, executed, and mythologized is the same sea where Luffy is raised, tested, and nearly executed? East Blue isn't a random starting zone. It's a hinge. The geography itself is haunted by Roger's choices. Here's the thing. Oda is quietly teaching you from chapter 1 that Luffy is walking into a story that started before he was born. Shanks passing down the hat, Garp hovering, Loguetown's slogan, the way every small island carries an echo of some bigger, older conflict. This is the series whispering, you are late to this party. You feel like you're watching a boy set off on an adventure. In reality, you're watching a system boot back up, and East Blue is just the loading screen. Once we leave that sea, Oda stops hiding the Roger parallels in implication and starts putting them in your face. Skypiea's bell, Sabaody's slave brand, Fishman Island's prophecy, Wano's closed borders. The question is not, is Luffy like Roger? The question is, at which point along this pre-drawn route does he finally break the script? Loguetown. 2 executions, 1 system glitch. And Oda makes that question literal the second we hit Loguetown, because the route Roger drew has a very specific landmark, the scaffold where pirate kings go to die. We need to talk about those 2 executions, because when you line those panels up, the story stops behaving like a normal adventure and starts behaving like a system glitching in real time. First, Roger. Public execution, center of town, the whole world watching through newspapers and rumor. He's sick. He's already turned himself in. He has every opportunity to go quietly. Instead, he walks up those steps like it's a stage entrance. He smiles. He looks at the crowd of desperate, hungry pirates and civilians and marines, and with his last breath, he doesn't confess. He doesn't repent. He inputs a command. My treasure, if you want it, you can have it. That is not a dying wish. That is a launch code. He turns his own death into a controlled detonation that boots up the Great Pirate era. Now fast forward to Luffy. Same town, same scaffold, same execution setup, but this time it's a joke villain. Buggy, clown sword raised, crowd laughing, and Luffy, who has not read the script, unconsciously hits all the same story beats. Captured, tied up, no escape route. He grins at his crew, apologizes, and accepts death without flinching. He is ready to die there, at the beginning of his journey, in the town that marks Roger's end. Then the system hard crashes. Lightning from a sudden storm obliterates the scaffold and saves him at the exact frame Buggy swings. No build-up, no weather foreshadowing, just a freak bolt from the sky. Here's the thing, a lot of you treat that as pure plot armor. Oda was still figuring the series out. It's gag logic, don't overthink it. And I say that with love. This is fine as a coping mechanism. But as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because once you mirror it with Roger's calm, premeditated, era-defining death, that lightning stops looking like luck and starts looking like the world system refusing an invalid input. Roger is allowed to die there because his job is to start the program. Luffy is not allowed to die there because his job is to finish it. And Oda underlines that this isn't random with one silent, smoking gun. Dragon. The most wanted man in the world, the guy leading the counter-system revolution, is just standing in Loguetown that day, watching. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Does that feel like coincidence to you? Or does it feel like key players gathered at a ritual site, at the point where the Pirate King's route begins and ends, to witness whether the successor gets past the checkpoint? Listen to me. This is the first visible sign that whatever Roger triggered with his death has created a protected corridor. Not plot armor in the comedic sense, but a narrative no-kill zone around the candidate who actually has to reach Laughtail alive. The storm isn't just weather. It's the system throwing an error message. And once you accept Loguetown as a checkpoint, you have to ask, what other coincidences on Luffy's route are actually the rails of that corridor quietly snapping into place? Rayleigh's warning, I could tell you everything. So if Loguetown is a checkpoint, Sabaody is the tutorial pop-up you're not supposed to skip. And of course, Oda puts Rayleigh there, the human patch note for the entire ancient system. We need to talk about that campfire conversation. Rayleigh literally sits the Straw Hats down and says, I can tell you everything. The Void Century, the ancient weapons, the One Piece, the whole history. That's not subtext. That is the right hand of Gold D. Roger offering to leak the final chapter to a bunch of mid-game players. And Luffy looks him in the face and says no. Not maybe later. Not give me a hint. Just flat refusal. Here's the thing. Fandom treats that as, ha ha ha, Luffy doesn't like spoilers, he's so quirky. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because right before that, Rayleigh drops the line everyone forgets. Their journey so far has been almost identical to Roger's. Same route, same islands, same escalation pattern. When you line those panels up, it's insane. Skypiea Bell? Roger was there. Fishman Island prophecy? Roger heard it first. Zoo's poneglyph? Roger already logged in. Listen to me. Oda did not make the most informed man on the planet say, almost identical by accident. This isn't nostalgia. This is an in-universe audit confirming that Luffy is running the Roger build. Rayleigh is basically telling you, yes, there is a blueprint. Yes, your guy is following it. No, I will not hand you the answer key because that's not how this system works. Why? Because the One Piece as a weaponized control node doesn't care if you've memorized the lore. It cares who you are when you arrive. Luffy refusing spoilers isn't just him protecting the adventure. It's the story protecting the calibration process. The system needs a user whose will has been stress-tested by Alabasta, by Eni's lobby, by Marineford, by Wano. Someone who has seen how the world government weaponizes history, how ancient promises get broken, how the seas themselves are cages. If Rayleigh dumps the Void Century on them at Sabaody, they skip the experiential part of the login sequence. They arrive at Laughtail with information, but without alignment. And that's how you get another Roger, A man who understands the mechanism, laughs at the punchline, and still walks away because it's too early. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. When Rayleigh says almost identical, what is he not saying? What are the deliberate gaps? Because if Oda is that precise, the differences on Luffy's route are not noise, they're the variables being tweaked, different allies, different casualties, different timing of weapons awakening. So the real question is, what has to be different this time for the system to actually turn on? And who, exactly, is going to pay for those differences? Skypiea, the filler arc that copies Roger's sky route. So when we ask, what has to be different this time? We need to talk about the arc everyone keeps trying to yeet into the sun. Skypiea. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You've either skipped it, thought about skipping it, or called it filler in a late-night power ranking. And I say that with love, because I did the exact same thing on my first read. Here's the thing. Skypiea is literally Luffy walking through Roger's cached save file in the sky. This is not a cute side quest. This is the story quietly showing you that the distributed database of the Void Century is already online, already mirroring data, and that both Roger and Luffy are authenticated users. Run the beats. Luffy gets blasted into the White Sea, stumbles into an entire Sky Island civilization, ends up in the ruins of Shandora, and rings the bell of Shandora so hard it physically shakes Jaya below. That's the emotional version. The technical version is, he discovers a poneglyph node, he pings it, and that ping propagates down to the blue sea as a visible, audible signal. It's literally a broadcast packet. And then Robin reads the log. On that Shandora stone, she doesn't just see some anonymous ancient script, she finds Goldie Roger's handwriting. We came here, we will carry this history forward, etc. Even more important, she notes that Roger could hear the voice of the poneglyph. That's the same language Oda uses for Sea Kings, Zunesha, all the living infrastructure tied into this weaponized system. When you line those panels up, Roger isn't just a guy who visited. He's an early access beta tester for the network. So what does Luffy do when he arrives at the same node decades later? He doesn't read or write, he rings. He sends a message. The story frames the bell as answering cricket down on Jaya, proving that Nolan's story, and by extension the erased history, is real. But that's the surface layer. Underneath, you have Roger leaving a text payload on the stone, and Luffy appending a follow-up signal in the only language he speaks. Action. Roger writes to the future. Luffy amplifies him. Listen to me. That is a distributed system. One user logs data, another user repings the same endpoint years later, confirming the route, refreshing the cache, and extending the chain of custody for this forbidden history. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to call that optional. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda literally has his archaeologists say Roger was here on panel. The blueprint is screaming. Pattern interrupt. If Skypiea is filler, then why is one of the 4 road poneglyphs, core keys to the One Piece system, introduced in the same breath as that bell? Why does the arc end with a zoom out of the world below, as if the planet itself just received a notification? Skypiea is the proof of concept for the poneglyphs as a global, redundant data architecture. Roger hits Shandora once, Luffy hits it again. 2 pings on the same node, different eras, same inherited will. You skip that, you are literally skipping the moment the story shows you Luffy stepping into Roger's footprints in the sky and confirming that the route is repeatable. And once you accept that, you have to ask the scarier question. If this is just one node, how many other places has Roger already tagged for Luffy to reping? Sabaody and the Public Enemy blueprint. So if Skypiea is one ping on the route, Sabaody is where Oda takes a hammer to your skull and goes, hey, this is not just a road trip. This is system activation. we need to talk about how both Roger and Luffy have to become public enemies in their 20s before the real story can even boot. Think about Roger first, not the meme version of him we carry around. The actual man the world government saw. His rise to Pirate King status doesn't just make him famous, it makes him singular. Every buster call, every cipher pole whisper, every paranoid conversation in Mariajois starts orbiting one name. Gold D. Roger becomes the answer to the question, what if someone actually finishes the ancient weapon login sequence? And the government's response is not subtle. They don't quietly assassinate him in a cell. They build a stage. They gather a crowd. They turn his death into a global broadcast of fear management and, accidentally, recruitment marketing. That execution platform is a control panel. Flip the lever. Create a symbol. Centralize all terror around one man. Now put Sabaody next to that. When you line those panels up, it's disgusting. Luffy walks into the slave auction, sees a celestial dragon shoot Hachi, and in one punch, he does what Roger's entire career did over years. He informs the system, "Hi, I am a bug in your code." He doesn't just hit a noble, he hits the untouchable root user of the world's operating system. That one act forces an admiral deployment, panics the human auction house, and sends a message up the chain that this random rookie from East Blue is an existential threat to the world order. That's not a bar fight. That's a declaration of war packet sent straight to the main server. Here's the thing. If you read both of these as random outbursts, you are nerfing Oda's entire blueprint. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. The system needs a focal point, a lightning rod. You cannot rally the oppressed, the curious, and the ambitious around a vague vibe. You rally them around a name the government itself has highlighted in red ink. Roger's Pirate King title and Luffy's Guy Who Punched a Celestial Dragon are the same structural beat. The world unconsciously agreeing, okay, that one, we're afraid of that one. And in both eras, who's standing right there at the threshold? Rayleigh, I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You think it's an accident that the Dark King is on the execution ship with Roger and then casually hanging out at Sabaody while Luffy recreates that energy. Rayleigh is literally the continuity of the blueprint, the human bridge between Pirate King and future system user. He watches Roger become the public enemy and then watches Luffy press the same button. And he smiles because he recognizes the protocol. Listen to me. Oda is teaching you a rule. Before you can rewrite the Void Century's legacy, before you can touch the One Piece as a world-scale weapon and not just treasure, the system has to acknowledge you. It has to flag you as a bug, isolate you, and throw everything at you. Only then can you reach the core files. And if that's the rule, the next question is terrifying. Once you're the designated public enemy, how do you survive long enough to actually reach the control room? Fishman Island, Roger's prophecy, Luffy's appointment. So if the system has flagged you as a bug, we need to talk about the first place it openly tells you that to your face, Fishman Island. Go back to Roger. Oden's flashback gives you this insane little scene that fandom treats like cute trivia. Roger, Oden, Neptune talking about a prophecy of two kings and the coming of a future day when Joy Boy's successor will meet Poseidon. Neptune is anxious. Oden is confused. Roger is grinning like a man who just read the last chapter of the story and realized he bought the volume too early. He literally says, "We were too early," and laughs. He knows he will never see the promised convergence of those kings, and he's hyped anyway. That is not normal pirate behavior. That is a project manager realizing the launch window is for the next team. Here's the thing. In Roger's era, all the components are visible, but nothing is clickable. He identifies Fishman Island as a node. He walks under Noah. He hears about Poseidon. Through Oden, he can even read the poneglyph that calls out Joy Boy's apology. The architecture is there. The weapon slot is labeled. But Poseidon is unborn. The Sea Kings are still in their waiting room. And the other king isn't even a thought in Dragon's head yet. Roger can map the system, not run it. Cut to Luffy face-planting into Fishman Island like he's just here for candy and racism cleanup. He saves Shirahoshi from Vanderdecken, protects her in that tiny room, yells at her to stop apologizing for existing. Then the curtain lifts. She's Poseidon, the current mermaid princess who can command sea kings. And those sea kings? They start talking. They literally say they've been waiting for the day two sovereigns meet, that the timing is still a little early, but the path is opening. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You really think that's just flavor text for a mid-tier post-time skip arc? When you line those panels up, the symmetry is eerie. Roger hears the prophecy, realizes he's the wrong save file, and laughs about being too early. Luffy has no idea there even is a script, stumbles into the exact same node, and his instinctive choices, shield Shirahoshi, punch Hody, declare Fishman Island under his protection, slot perfectly into the prophecy's requirements. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend that's accidental. Fishman Island is a system checkpoint. It's the Poseidon module boot sequence. Roger's era ran diagnostics, identify Fishman Island, locate Noah, log the existence of a future Poseidon. Luffy's era provides the user credential. The system finally sees the right king standing next to the awakened weapon and quietly flips a flag from offline to standby. And if one weapon slot just went from grey to green, you should already be asking, what happens when the rest of the dashboard lights up? Whitebeard's speech, Roger's will has a name. And if one weapon slot just went from grey to green, you should already be asking, what happens when the rest of the dashboard lights up? Good. Because Oda already staged the answer once in the loudest possible way with the loudest possible man. We need to talk about Marineford. Specifically, the moment the world's strongest relic of Roger's era uses his dying breath. Not to mourn Ace, not to curse Sengoku, but to scream a prophecy at an audience of Den Den Mushi. The One Piece is real. That is not a private character beat. That is a global push notification. That is Oda grabbing the camera away from every other subplot and going, hey you, remember the treasure, it matters. Here's the thing, Whitebeard doesn't stop there. He immediately folds it into Roger's will and the will of D. He says the day will come when someone challenges the world, bearing Roger's will. He says the world government fears that war above all else. Killing one man, one pirate, one monster, will never extinguish the tide. This is not vague inspirational poster talk. This is explicit systems language. You can't shut down the program by deleting a single user. Now, I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Who is standing there bleeding out, watching this speech in real time? Who just threw his rubber body at 3 admirals, rang the war bell of the old era, and collapsed at Whitebeard's feet? The story literally drags Luffy into Marineford, breaks every bone in his body, and positions him center frame as Whitebeard announces the next challenger to the entire world. When you line those panels up, it's embarrassing to pretend he's talking about some hypothetical future guy. And I say that with love, because I used to do the same dance. Oh, he just means a D will rise. It's symbolic. Anyone could inherit the will. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Oda does not have a random D-kid crash the execution of Roger's son, survive direct contact with Sengoku, Garp, Akainu, Blackbeard, Mihawk, and then have the last emperor of the old age literally die announcing, the throne will be challenged for that kid to be a decoy. Listen to me. Marineford is the baton pass. Whitebeard's body is physically torn apart, his era is visually shattered, and his final act is to name the shape of the war Roger started but didn't finish. The camera cuts to Luffy. The Marines scream his name. The world sees his face. That is the series formally logging Luffy as the inheritor of Roger's unfinished job, not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda is screaming it in 72-point font. So if the world just watched the will of Roger and the will of D get assigned a face and a bounty poster, the only real question left is, what exactly is that will trying to do to the system under the surface? Garp, the marine pillar chasing two pirate kings. And the answer the story gives you first is not Joy Boy, not Emu, not even Dragon. It's an old man with a dog mask and a brick for a fist. We need to talk about Garp, because if Luffy just got formally logged as Roger's successor in the world's eyes, Garp is the shared marine pillar whose whole job is to chase that will and fail to kill it. He's the constant, he's the control variable in Oda's experiment. Roger era, Luffy era, same stubborn grandpa throwing cannonballs with his bare hands and pretending that's normal. Start with Roger. Garp is introduced to you as hero of the Marines, the guy who cornered the Pirate King countless times. Sengoku literally says they nearly killed each other. These aren't polite skirmishes. These are era-defining collisions. And yet, in the same breath, Roger trusts Garp with the single most dangerous baby on the planet. My son will be hunted by the world, but I trust you. That is insane. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to treat that as a quirky gag. Here's the thing. When you line those panels up, Garp is simultaneously the sword and the shield of the world government. He hunts Roger, but he shelters Ace. He is the system, but he is also the hole in the firewall the D keeps slipping through. Now parallel that with Luffy. Garp raises this rubber gremlin, throws him off cliffs, sends him into the jungle alone, trains him with fists that are one rank below a Buster Call. Why? Because he's trying to hammer that same dangerous will into a Marine uniform. You'll be a great Marine. He's literally attempting to reroute the Roger problem into the organization that failed to stop Roger. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Has there ever been a single frame where Garp actually looks surprised that Luffy became a pirate? He's horrified, he's furious, he's dramatic for comedy, but deep down he reacts like a man watching a prophecy he tried to smother with push-ups. Look at his face at Eni's lobby when he hears about Luffy punching a world noble proxy and declaring war on the government. At Marineford, when his grandson is the one invading the execution platform to save the son of the man he once hunted. He freezes on those steps because the geometry is identical. Pirate King's legacy on the scaffold. D. Child charging in. Garp standing between the system and the storm. And he moves. Not to kill Luffy, but to let himself be knocked aside. That's not just grandpa love. That is the world's strongest Marine formally failing to enforce the sentence on the will of D twice in one lifetime. Even post-Wano, when Gear 5 leaks through the newspapers and people whisper about Nika, Garp's reaction is written as this horrible mix of pride and dread. He recognizes the silhouette. He's seen that laugh. He knows exactly what it means when a D turns the battlefield into a cartoon. Listen to me. Garp's whole character is Oda putting a structural beam in the story that says the system will always generate an internal dissenter. Someone with enough power and conscience to see the D as human, not weapons or treasure, and that person will inevitably fail to contain them and accidentally enable them instead. So if Garp is the Marine constant between Roger and Luffy, the next question isn't, will the Navy stop the D? It's, who's going to be the Garp of the final war? And what happens when the pillar itself finally cracks? Shanks, the data courier between two eras. So if Garp is the Marine constant that keeps cracking, we need to talk about the red-haired variable Oda keeps parking right at the hinge of history. Shanks is not just the cool uncle who gave Luffy a hat. Listen to me. Inside this story, he is literally the only person who has stood on Laugh Tale with Roger and then personally handed the next protagonist his quest item. That's not vibes. That's architecture. Go back. On Roger's ship, Shanks is the kid. He's the one crying when Roger and Odin come back from Laugh Tale. The one who hears, "We were too early." The one who sails through the end of the Great Pirate era with the full, unredacted patch notes of the Void Century and the weapon system sitting in his head. Everyone else from that era either dies, retires, or becomes a legend you have to seek out. Shanks walks into the New Age with that data live. And where does he go? East Blue, the backwater tutorial sea. Here's the thing. You don't accidentally anchor in Fuchsia Village when you're a Yonker caliber monster with a copy of the true history in your brain. He bumps into this rubber kid with a death wish, pokes at him, tests him. Are you serious about going to sea? Will you throw your life away for someone else? Will you stand there, shaking, and still say, "I'm not afraid," to a Sea King's face? When you line those panels up, the hat handoff stops being sentimental and becomes a relay. Roger's straw hat, which Shanks wore as the apprentice who saw Laughtail, gets passed to Luffy with a very specific condition. Bring it back to me someday. That's not just chase your dream, kid. That's Shanks explicitly tying Luffy's dream to Roger's unfinished route. You don't give the symbol of the Pirate King to a random child unless you're tracking a blueprint only you and your dead captain have seen. Fast forward. Marineford. Shanks walks into the greatest execution spectacle since Roger stops the war with a sentence and publicly bets the future on this era of pirates that Ace's brother will lead. He is cashing in his Laughtail knowledge there. He's telling Sengoku in front of the world, "I've seen the previous build of this story, and that kid is the patch." Then you get the Gorosei meeting. Red hair, the supposed carefree Yonko, privately negotiating with the top of the world government about a certain pirate. Not because I am smarter than you, but if you still think Shanks is just vibing, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. He is managing information. He is throttling what the old system knows about the new user. Shanks is a human USB drive. Roger uploads the full ancient weapon system, the Void Century log, the punchline of Joy Boy's treasure, and Shanks walks around with that encrypted in his choices. He never info dumps Luffy. He never tells him what the One Piece is, what Laughtail is, what the D is. He just nudges, saves him from a Sea King, stops a war, keeps the Marines and the government from deleting the file before it boots. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. What did Shanks see on that final island that made him so certain this rubber idiot from East Blue was the correct heir to Roger's hat? And what is he still refusing to say, even as he finally moves toward Luffy now? Crew reactions. How two pirate kings infect their families. So let's answer that Shanks question sideways, because the hat isn't the only thing Luffy inherited. He inherited the way a D turns a ship into a field of gravity where common sense goes to die. Go back to Oden's journal panels of Roger. Every major decision reads like a war crime against logistics. Let's sail to a sky island. Let's open the borders of an isolationist nation that hates us. The crew reaction pattern is always the same. Shock, complaint, acceptance. Oden calls him out. Rayleigh sighs and lights another cigarette. Scopper just quietly adjusts the sails. They live in that oscillation between, "Captain, you're actually insane," and, "Well, if you're going, we're going." Here's the thing. We've already watched that exact emotional waveform run across the Sunny. When Luffy finally tells the Straw Hats his real dream, Oda literally draws the same rhythm. First, stunned faces, Usopp yelling, Nami going, "That's impossible." Then the turn. One by one they smile, cry, or call him an idiot, while promising to back it anyway. Disbelief, then unconditional backing. It's not a speech, it's a gravitational event. When you line those panels up with Roger's crew laughing on the Oro Jackson after Laughtail, it stops feeling like a cute echo and starts reading like an inherited operating system. Roger sees the true history, the ancient weapon network, the Void Century punchline, and he laughs so hard the crew breaks. Luffy hits Gear 5, turns into a literal cartoon in front of people who've been traumatized by gods and tyrants, and what happens? Terror, then hysterical laughter. Kid, Law, even Kaido's own men get dragged into the bit. Listen to me, these are trauma cases. Oden is a walking exile. Rayleigh is a burned-out gambler hiding from history. Scopper is so loyal, he basically erases himself from the narrative afterward. On the Sunny, you've got a child soldier, a trafficked cyborg, a genocide survivor, a disgraced prince, a girl who watched her mother executed over a forbidden language. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend they're just quirky anime buddies. Roger doesn't fix them with inspirational monologues. Luffy doesn't either. What they do is repeatedly bet their lives on an absurd ideal in front of witnesses, over and over. We're going to the end of the world. I'm going to be Pirate King. I'm going to ring the bell in the sky. I'm going to punch a Yonko in the face because my friend cried. The crew watches the captain stake his existence, survive, and laugh. The emotional code rewrites itself, from learned helplessness to, if he can move, the world can move. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. That contagious conviction is not just charisma. Oda keeps putting it in the mouths of people who know the D name. Whitebeard, Rayleigh, even Kaido read Luffy and Roger as the same type of storm. The D isn't just a bloodline, it's a firmware that turns everyone around you into distributed processors for a single will. And that matters for the One Piece's system, because if the treasure is actually the master control node for a planet-scale mechanism, one man physically cannot run it. You need a crew that can hold shards of that will, interface with different parts of the world, and keep moving after the switch is flipped. Roger built that social architecture once, then walked away. Luffy is rebuilding it in real time, with misfits mapped to every subsystem the ancient kingdom left behind. So the question stops being, will Luffy reach Laugh Tale? And becomes, what is this network of believers being calibrated to do when he does? And we need to talk about how Oda has been stress testing that network at every single sea change in the story. The D and the smile, death flags as design features. And to stress test that network, Oda keeps aiming one specific gun at their heads. The D doesn't just inherit will, the D inherits how to die. Run the tape. Roger on the scaffold, smiling while the entire world government spectacle is calibrated for one thing: fear. Ace in Marineford, chest punched through, grinning as he thanks Luffy for loving him. Saul in O'Hara, laughing through Buster Call artillery while he carries Robin toward a future he will never see. Luffy in Loguetown, neck on the block under Buggy's blade, storm cracking overhead, smiling like this is a festival game and not an execution. When you line those panels up, the "they're just fearless" take falls apart in about 3 seconds. Fearless people flinch. Fearless people get angry. Fearless people spit in the face of the system. What Roger and Ace and Saul and Luffy do is weirder and more specific. They refuse to give the system the emotional data it's asking for. The scaffold, the plaza, the burning island, the public execution, they are all machines designed to harvest terror, submission, despair. And the D-Clan keeps throwing a smile into the input slot. Here's the thing, that isn't quirky characterization. That's a design feature. It's a compatibility test. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If the final truth at Laugh Tale is actually horrifying, void century genocide receipts, ancient weapon schematics, the revelation that the entire world is balanced on a man-made disaster machine, what kind of person can look at that punchline and laugh? Not because they don't understand it, because they understand it completely and still don't break. That's what ties the Laugh Tale laughter to the D-Death smiles. Same emotional muscle group, same refusal to let horror dictate the tone of your response. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to say, they're just goofy pirates. Oda is showing you a bloodline that treats existential dread like slapstick. And once you frame it that way, the Ancient Kingdom's choice snaps into focus. If you're building a world-scale system, this weapon/treasure that can flatten continents and rewrite oceans, you do not hand the root password to people who crumble when they see the changelog. You entrust it to carriers whose defining trait is emotional resilience in the face of cosmic bad news. People who won't be corrupted by the power or paralyzed by the guilt of using it. Not because I am smarter than you, but because my brain is broken in a very specific pattern-seeking way. I can't unsee this. Luffy and Roger are the most extreme expressions of that trait. Roger laughs at the true history, walks away from the switch, and uses his own execution as content to seed a better candidate. Luffy walks through Impel Down, Marineford, Onigashima, Egghead, watching the world order crack, and every time the system tries to make him despair, he just doesn't. So when those two interface with the One Piece system, they don't get overwritten. They don't get recruited. They stay themselves. And that, more than bloodline or destiny, is what makes them terrifying to the people who built the current world. Which raises the next problem. If the D are emotionally compatible hardware, who's been trying to jailbreak them for 800 years? And how is Luffy breaking that script? Joy Boy, Roger, Luffy. One roll, 3 attempts. So if the D are the jailbreakable hardware, listen to me. We need to talk about the 3 people who actually tried to run the program. Start with Joy Boy. All we really have is the wreckage. An apology to Fishman Island carved into stone. A promise tied to Noah, this absurdly huge ark parked under the sea like a half-finished installation file. And a pattern. He clearly attempted something massive, something world-scale, and it didn't boot. The weapon system doesn't fire. The island doesn't move. The promised day for the Fishman never arrives. What we're looking at in that poneglyph is not just regret. It's a crash log. Then Oda overlays Roger on top of that ghost. Roger reaches Laughtail, reads the full history, and learns exactly what Joy Boy was trying to do. Not vibes, not a metaphor, the whole blueprint. And his response is that line everyone loves to quote with swelling music: "We were too early." Too early for what? Here's the thing, that only makes sense if there is a concrete system state that has to be met. Poseidon hasn't awakened in Shirahoshi yet. Wano is still closed, Pluton is sealed. The alliances and pirate era conditions aren't spun up. Roger is Joy Boy 2.0 doing a diagnostic run. He maps the poneglyph network. He tests the route. He confirms the One Piece system exists, but he refuses to execute because the parameters are wrong. And I say that with love. This is where a lot of you retreat into, he just wanted someone to have fun with the adventure instead. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. When you line those panels up, Roger laughing at the final island, Roger telling Odin they were too early, Roger begging Whitebeard to hear about that dream. It's not a man walking away from a prank. It's a man walking away from a loaded weapon he doesn't trust himself or his era to fire, which is exactly where Luffy comes in as Iteration 3. He doesn't just coincidentally inherit Joy Boy's will, he literally inherits Joy Boy's fruit, the ancient user interface to the system. He arrives in the precise prophesied era Roger tried to ignite with that execution speech. Poseidon is born and awakened. The supernova generation exists. Wano is opening. Revolutionary armies, Yonko defections, ancient weapons, everything Roger saw as missing pieces are now, one by one, coming online around Luffy. So here's the model. Joy Boy is original execution attempt, fails, leaves apology and infrastructure. Roger is the diagnostic pass, collects data, updates the poneglyph database, starts the pirate era as a long-term setup. Luffy is final execution with debugged conditions, correct fruit, correct era, correct network of allies, and a personality that reflexively rejects static control. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is terrifyingly consistent. The Luffy-Roger parallels are not just haha same hat, same laugh. They're two users occupying the same system role at different phases of an 800-year deployment cycle. One starts it, one understands it, one has to decide what to actually do with it, and that decision is where everything breaks, because if Luffy is Joy Boy 3.0, what happens if he refuses to run the program the way it was written? Building the system. Void Century as deleted patch notes. So if Luffy is Joy Boy 3.0 and Roger is Joy Boy 2.0, we need to talk about the operating system they're both messing with. Because you're treating the Void Century like a tragic lore cutscene, and Oda is treating it like deleted patch notes. Here's the thing. 100 years of history do not just go missing. That's not ambience. That's someone ripping out the README, the design doc, and the commit history for how this world was originally built. The Ancient Kingdom isn't just a cool lost civilization, it's the original dev team. The One Piece isn't just a treasure, it's the master control node of their world-scale system. And the Void Century is where they wrote down what the system was for. Think of the current world as a janky legacy app running on top of a sabotaged OS. You've got the red line hard-coded through the middle of the map, the calm belts as weird anti-piracy DRM, Fishman Island shoved under a tectonic firewall. None of this is natural. It's what happens when you fork Joy Boy's project, delete a century of documentation, and let the world government ship a cursed build to production. The poneglyphs. That's your distributed database. Shandora's stone, Alabaster's, Zoo, Wano. They're not just lore tablets, they're chunks of the original patch notes, mirrored across the globe so you can't wipe them all without bricking the system. When you line those panels up of Robin tracing the letters, and Odin reading for Roger, what you're watching is a team slowly reconstructing a lost repo from backup fragments. Roger's crew basically did a messy code review of the whole thing. Odin raids the stones. Roger connects the dots. Rayleigh literally offers to tell you everything at Sabaody. They get the philosophy, they see the joke, they understand the weapon. But their hardware isn't ready. Poseidon hasn't spawned yet. Wano's borders are a physical permissions lock on Pluton. The alliances and inherited wills Joy Boy's system expects as user input. Not present. Roger reaches Loguetown, realizes the world is on version 0.9, and walks away from pressing run. Not because he's a coward, not because I am smarter than you and see something you don't, because the deployment environment is wrong. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If all of that was just build up to a big chest of gold, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Luffy's era is different because the hardware is finally booting. Shirahoshi awakens as Poseidon. Wano opens, putting Pluton on the table. Uranus is lurking in Emu's shadow. Robin isn't just reading the manual, the Straw Hats are standing next to the on switch. So Roger's role is understanding the patch. Luffy's role is running it. And listen to me, running it means accepting that the system update will be catastrophic by design. You don't remove the red line, flood entire seas, and drag Fishman Island to the surface without global downtime. The question is not, will it break the world? The question is whether Luffy, the guy who keeps rejecting crowns, will still choose to hit execute. And Oda has been quietly wiring the story so that, this time, the user can't just walk away from the prompt. Ancient weapons, Pluton, Poseidon, Uranus as system modules. If you're still treating the ancient weapons like random endgame nukes Oda sprinkled in for spice, we need to talk about your coping mechanisms. Because once you read the One Piece as a system, those weapons stop being boss fights and start looking like mandatory system modules. Quick refresher so we're on the same page. Pluton, originally hyped in Alabaster, then quietly relocated to Wano's underground in the history. A literal nation-killer warship whose activation is tied to opening Wano's borders and probably smashing the red line. Poseidon, Shirahoshi herself, the mermaid princess who can command sea kings, that is, living infrastructure that can tow Noah, move islands, and stabilize or destroy sea routes. Uranus, the big question mark, but whatever Imu used to erase Lulusia from the map, that's world-level, orbital-feeling power. That's your third module. Here's the thing, Roger's era already found the spec sheet. Odin's flashback flat out tells you they visited Fishman Island, they knew about Poseidon's future birth, they went to Wano and read about Pluton, they reached Loguetown and saw the full Void Century blueprint. They had the documentation, They did not deploy the build. Why? Too early is not just vibes, it's a hard lock. Poseidon wasn't born yet, Wano was closed and refusing to open the floodgates. Uranus was apparently in the hands of the enemy, or at least not wrestled away from the world government. You don't press execute on a world reset when two of your core processes are offline and the third is actively hostile. Unless you're a psychopath. Roger wasn't. Now look at Luffy. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Does this man look like he's hunting super weapons? No. But when you line those panels up, he keeps walking straight into admin keys. Fishman Island. He befriends Shirahoshi, promises to protect her, literally stands between Poseidon and the world government's prophecy of destruction. Wano. He becomes the face of the alliance that liberates the country whose basement is Pluton's cradle, and his very presence pushes Momonosuke toward opening the borders. Mary Jawaz and the Reverie fallout. His declaration of war on the celestial dragons and Imu's obsession with erasing his D puts him in direct collision with whoever is holding Uranus remote. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend these are coincidences. The One Piece system almost certainly needs all three modules lined up under a single will to run the true history patch. Remove the red line, raise Fishman Island, flatten the seas. Roger reached the console, saw that the only way to execute was to centralize terrifying power under himself, and refused. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda literally has him laugh, walk away, and instead broadcast a recruitment ad for his successor. Luffy's journey is that recruitment ad playing out in slow motion. He's not hoarding weapons. He's unconsciously collecting trust. Shirahoshi's trust, Wano's trust around Pluton, a future coalition that can rip Uranus out of Imu's hands or neutralize it. Piece by piece, he's gaining the only route access Roger didn't have, a world willing to let him decide. Which raises the real nightmare question for the next section. What happens when the system finally recognizes Luffy as the legitimate user Joy Boy was waiting for? Lufftail as control room, not treasure vault. That's the nightmare, right? The moment the system stops treating Luffy as a glitch and recognizes him as the intended user. Because listen to me, that's when Lufftail stops being a meme island and snaps into focus as what it actually is in this story. Not a cave full of gold, not a Dragon Ball Z side quest reward chest, a terminal. We need to talk about how broken your mental image of Lufftail probably is. You've been trained by 1,000 fan edits to picture Treasure Island. Mountains of ancient gold, Joy Boy's diary, maybe a goofy hat. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. When you line those panels up, the Poneglyph network, the ancient weapons, the red line as a literal planetary firewall, Lufftail stops reading like a vault and starts reading like the control room at the center of a world-scale weapon. Here's the thing. The Poneglyphs are not a scavenger hunt for lore freaks. They're a distributed database. History logs, coordinates, weapon specs, access keys. Lufftail is where that database compiles. It's the final interface where all that void century data, all that ancient tech, and every system trigger converge into something you can actually use. Roger got there, with Odin, with the ability to hear the stones, with the Pirate King crew. And what did they get? Read-only access. They saw the UI. They scrolled through the options. They laughed at Joy Boy's absurd punchline because they understood that a single island contained the power to literally rewrite the seas, and that the entire current world order exists to bury that fact under genocide and propaganda. But the system threw an error. Conditions not met. Poseidon not awakened. Wano still closed. Pluton still sealed. Uranus in the wrong hands. No coalition, no inherited will chain ready to handle the fallout. Too early wasn't we're not emotionally ready. It was the execute button is grayed out, and even if it weren't, pressing it now would be monstrous. So Roger walks away, uses his death to start a recruitment drive instead of a cataclysm. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is meaner than you think, that choice is the whole spine of the story. Now run that forward to Luffy. When he hits Laugh Tale, he's not just going to find the One Piece as an object, he's going to boot up a live interface. This time Poseidon exists and trusts him. Wano is open. Pluton can be unsealed. The world is already on fire. The system will not be able to say too early anymore. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. What does a guy who keeps refusing crowns do when the crown is a button that can erase the red line? Because the next piece of this blueprint is ugly. What it actually means for Luffy to laugh at that choice the same way Roger did, and then do something Roger couldn't. If One Piece is a trigger, what exactly does it do? So if the crown is actually a button, we have to ask the question everyone keeps dodging. What happens when you push it? Here's the thing. Oda has been screaming the world-scale stakes at you for decades. Rising sea levels. The red line framed as this weird, unnatural scar around the planet. Madame Shyali flat out prophesying Luffy destroying Fishman Island. The repeated talk of the dawn of the world like we're waiting for a literal sunrise after a 1,000-year night. This is not the setup for "and then they found a chest and had a party." This is a system waiting to flip states. So, listen to me. If the One Piece is a trigger, then its function has to match those stakes. You don't foreshadow global flooding, an artificial continental wall, and a promised dawn just to hand Luffy a check and a gag. The cleanest model is that the One Piece initiates a catastrophic but necessary reconfiguration of the planet. Destroy the Red Line, collapse Marie-Joie, merge the Four Seas, force the Blues and the Grand Line into one continuous ocean. Fishman Island, currently under the Red Line, gets obliterated in the process, but its people finally move to the surface like Joy Boy promised. And suddenly, Joy Boy's failure reads very differently. He didn't just fail to show up with a giant straw hat and vibes, he failed to complete the reconfiguration. The Void Century War built the infrastructure, the ancient weapons, the poneglyph network. But something, lack of allies, timing, resistance from the 20 Kings, meant he couldn't pull the final switch without causing extinction-level collateral. So the world got stuck in this half-changed, broken configuration. Roger gets there next. He reaches Laugh Tale, reads the history, sees the full blueprint, laughs at Joy Boy's intention, and then he realizes he's too early. Not just emotionally, technically and morally. Poseidon isn't awakened yet. Wano is closed, Pluton is sealed, the seas are politically fragmented. If he hits the trigger now, he's not liberating the world, he's drowning it. So he walks away, and I say that with love, as a man who absolutely would have mashed that button out of curiosity. This is where the Luffy-Roger parallels stop being cute and start being terrifying. When you line those panels up, Loguetown, Skypiea, Sabaody, Fishman Island, you see a route designed to gather exactly the people you'd need to survive that reset. Fishmen who can navigate the flood, revolutionary allies who can topple what's left of the world government, former warlords, ex-marines, Yonko fleets, a surgeon who can literally operate on life itself. Every shared beat in their journeys is Roger scouting the dungeon and Luffy doing the actual clear. Roger inspires an era. Luffy consolidates it into a social safety net for the apocalypse. And yes, this is speculative. But compare it to the Treasure and Party reading. That reading has to ignore the apocalyptic foreshadowing, the ancient weapons, the Void Century genocide, the Red Line discourse. This model takes all of that seriously. The One Piece as a world reset weapon is the only version where Luffy's final laugh has real teeth. Which raises the next problem. What kind of person do you have to be to press that button on purpose? But it's just a fun adventure story. The copy and reading. You want to know the terrifying answer. A lot of people really want that person to be nobody. They want the button to be fake. They want the blueprint to be a punchline. So let me Steelman that for you, because it's not a dumb take. The comfy reading goes like this. Oda writes parallels because they're cool. Roger and Luffy laugh the same way because the D is about smiling through hardship. The Void Century is tragic, sure. But the One Piece itself? That's the world's greatest prank. A testament to adventure, to friendship, to wasn't it fun to live? Not press this weapon and reformat the planet. In that version, the treasure is heartwarming. The storm passes. The system basically stays. And listen to me, I get why you want that. I want to live in that story. You fell in love with found family on the Merry and the Sunny, not a white paper on systemic horror. You signed up for Luffy punching bad dads, not for the narrative equivalent of reading a UN report on genocide. Emotionally, the idea that the D-Clan are just professional smilers, that Roger's laugh and Luffy's laugh are purely about courage and vibes, is incredibly soothing. Here's the thing. That reading only works if you treat half the manga like optional side content. Ohara is not a quirky backstory. The Buster Call that literally erases an island of librarians from the map is the series looking you in the eye and saying, this world kills history on purpose. Sabaody is not just a cool supernova meetup, it is a slave market where celestial dragons keep people in chains as decor. Lulusia is not a random gag kingdom. It is wiped off the map by a God's Eye laser, while the narrator tells you explicitly that it has been erased. When you line those panels up with God Valley implications, with mass graves and countries that vanished, with Fisher Tiger's story, you do not get wholesome mismanagement. You get industrialized atrocity. You get a machine that runs on erased people. To insist that One Piece is just a fun adventure story, at this stage, you have to flatten all of that into background noise. You have to downplay Robin's entire existence. You have to pretend that every time a character says, this world is wrong, they're being melodramatic instead of accurate. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. And I say that with love, not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is screaming in the margins. The Luffy-Roger blueprint reading is not joyless cynicism, it's taking the author at his word. If Roger reaches Laugh Tale, learns the ancient truth, sees the weaponized system, and walks away saying too early, that's not a setup for surprise. It was just a goofy joke. That's a man refusing to pull a trigger. So the real question becomes, what does it mean that Oda is marching Luffy down the exact same route, with the volume turned up on every horror Roger only glimpsed? The canon receipts versus vibe readings, taking Oda seriously. So if Roger walked away from the trigger, we need to talk about why Oda keeps shoving the same gun into Luffy's hands on panel, not in vibes, in receipts. Rayleigh literally spells it out at Sabaody. He looks at the Straw Hats and goes, "You've basically followed the same route we did." That's not a cute nostalgia line. That is the right hand of the Pirate King telling you, explicitly, that Luffy is not just a pirate, he is on the Roger route. Same islands, same checkpoints, same data packets of ancient history, just with the difficulty slider cranked up. Then you stack Whitebeard's speech at Marineford on top of that. That man Roger is waiting for someone, the one who will challenge the world. Not some dude who likes freedom. The world, the system. When you line those panels up with Rayleigh's route comment, you get a very boring conclusion that people run from. The story is funneling one specific idiot rubber boy to Laugh Tale to finish a job Roger refused. Fishman Island makes it worse. Madame Shiali's prophecy is not a pirate will maybe cause some trouble. She sees Luffy, his actual face, and predicts he will destroy Fishman Island. Straightforward reading. Luffy is directly entangled with whatever world-scale weapon or geography reset is coming. You can cope and go, maybe that's just a metaphor for social change. And I say that with love. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Imu casually deleting Lulusia? That's your tech demo. That's Oda putting the Void Century weaponization on screen in the present. So when Luffy reaches the One Piece, you already know the ceiling of what pressing the wrong button looks like. Vegapunk backs it up. This world is not what you think it is. Warnings about the true nature of the sea, the ancient energy source, the erased history. Here's the thing, He's describing a built system, not a chest, a control architecture. Read all of that straight, and it points one way. Massive, intentional convergence at Laugh-Tale, with Luffy as the designated user. Not because I am smarter than you, because Oda is screaming it in dialogue balloons, and we keep turning it into reaction images, and this is where fandom habits flatten everything. We memeify Whitebeard's speech. We isolate Roger laughing at Laugh-Tale from the genocide and the weapons and the prophecy network that frame that laugh. We treat the Void Century foreshadowing as aesthetic mood lighting instead of functional wiring. But respecting Oda means assuming he's not wasting panels. If he mirrors Roger and Luffy this precisely across decades, it's not an accident. Listen to me. You don't get Rayleigh's root line, Whitebeard's Chosen One speech, Fishman Island's prophecy, Emu's island deletion, and Vegapunk's World is a Lie monologue in the same story by coincidence. So I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Do you want the comfy version where the One Piece is a big goofy treasure and Luffy just vibes? Or the version that actually accounts for the full weight of what the story has shown you? Because once you pick, the next parallel between Luffy and Roger stops being cute and starts being terrifying. Roger's laugh. Revisited, the horror behind the smile. So if you pick the comfy version, I need you to be very honest with me for a second, because we're going back to Laugh-Tale and I'm going to ruin that scene for you on purpose. You remember it as the meme, right? Roger and his crew, end of the Grand Line, they find the One Piece, they read the true history and they just lose it. They laugh, they slap the floor. Joy Boy, what an idiot! Peak adventure energy. Peak, the real treasure was the friends we made along the way. Now, stop. Rewind that scene and put a horror soundtrack under it. Strip out the bright skies, drain the color, hold on their faces one panel longer than is comfortable. A ship full of pirates reaches the literal end of the world, uncovers that the last 800 years of history are built on a lie and a genocide, learns that an ancient weaponized system is sitting under their feet like a dormant nuke aimed at the planet. And they respond by howling with laughter. That's not wholesome. That's not goofy treasure reveal. That is the reaction of people staring at something so absurdly cruel, so cosmically unfair, that their brains do the only thing they can to not snap in half. They treat the end of the world as a punchline because the alternative is screaming. Here's the thing. In horror, this is a trope. Characters glimpse an eldritch truth, a void they cannot fit inside their skulls, and they start laughing. Not because it's actually funny, because it's too big, too wrong to process any other way. When you line those panels up with, say, classic cosmic horror framing, Roger and his crew look less like adventurers at a comedy show and more like cultists who just realized their god was real and hates them. And Oda knows exactly what he's doing. He wraps it in comedic timing, big open mouths, party vibes, because if he played that scene straight, with the level of world building we have now about the Void Century, the weapons, the genocides, you would have immediately gone, oh, the One Piece is a control system for mass destruction. The joke tone is a safety lock. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Listen to me. That laugh is a horror beat in disguise, and that's why Luffy is an emotional time bomb. We already know he laughs at his ridiculous dream. We already know he's going to reach the same island, read the same history, stare at the same ancient mechanism. Does he laugh the same way? Does his crew? Or does he laugh and then do the one thing Roger couldn't bring himself to do? Because if Roger's laugh was the sound of a man stepping back from the switch, Luffy's might be the sound right before someone finally flips it. Luffy's ridiculous dream. The missing half of Roger's laugh. And that brings us to the most weaponized piece of off-screen dialogue in the entire story. Luffy's ridiculous dream. You know the scene. Sunny at night, everyone hanging out, and Oda finally does the thing he's been teasing since Sabo's flashback. Luffy goes, "Oh yeah, there's something I never told you." He says his real dream, the one beyond, "I'm gonna be Pirate King." And what do we see? Frankie bawling, Usopp screaming, Robin covering her mouth. Jinbei stunned, Nami going, "That's so you." And then all of them, in different ways, calling it absurd, impossible, ridiculous. And we never hear the words. Here's the thing, that's the exact same narrative move as Laugh Tale. Roger reaches the end, reads the true history, sees the ancient mechanism, and the whole crew just breaks. They laugh, they cry, they call Joy Boy's story ridiculous. Oda cuts away from the content and shows you the reaction. Decades later, he runs the same experiment with Luffy and his crew. Same structure, different angle. When you line those panels up, it's the same emotional equation with one missing variable. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Maybe it's just something silly like a giant party take? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Oda is not hiding a gag for 30 years. He's hiding the second half of a sentence that started on Laugh Tale. My read is simple. Roger gets to the system at the end of the world, learns the Void Century truth, realizes the One Piece is a control node for a planet-scale weapon that can flatten the red line and rewrite the map, and he laughs. Why? Because the punchline is cosmic irony. The world is being strangled by an ancient machine built by people who wanted freedom. That's horrifying, but it's also absurd. It's the universe's worst dad joke. Now flip that. Luffy grows up with Shanks' hat, Roger's inherited will, and zero interest in ruling anyone. His secret dream is not be king. That's just the key to get into the room. His real dream is his personal positive rewrite of the same truth that made Roger laugh. He hears about this world reset weapon and goes, "Okay, then I'll use it to do X." A concrete, joyful goal big enough that his crew cries because it's beautiful and laughs because it's insane. And listen to me. I think Roger had that same dream, or something close. He could see the world that should exist after the switch gets flipped. He just didn't have Poseidon awakened, Wano opened, or the alliances Luffy is accidentally speedrunning. So his laugh at Laugh Tale is bittersweet. This is what the world could be, but not yet. Not with my hands. Luffy is the software patch. Roger's generation installed the hardware, mapped the poneglyph database, and proved the system works. Luffy gets the same horror update Roger did, feels the same urge to laugh. But his ridiculous dream is the thing that lets him respond with a plan instead of paralysis. So the real question isn't, what is his dream in isolation? It's, what dream could only exist after someone like Roger walked away? Because once you see it that way, you can start predicting the shape of that dream from the shape of the system he's destined to break. Vegapunk, O'Hara, and the data layer of the blueprint. So if Luffy's dream is only possible after Roger walks away, we need to talk about the invisible thing that changed between their eras. Not a sword, not a ship, a hard drive. Here's the thing, O'Hara is the first time Oda shows you what happens when the world's operating system detects someone peeking at the source code. You've got an island of scholars, politely doing the nerdiest treason imaginable, trying to reconstruct the Void Century by cross-referencing poneglyph rubbings and conventional history. They don't build a weapon. They don't even shout about revolution. They just learn too much. And the second they cross that invisible threshold, the world government answers with a buster call that erases the island off the map like a corrupted save file, with Robin as the only surviving backup. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If the One Piece were just treasure, why does the story spend this much panel time on librarians getting nuked? This isn't flavor text. This is Oda showing you that information itself is treated as a world-ending weapon. O'Hara proves that even partial reconstruction of the ancient blueprint is enough to trigger total annihilation. The message is simple. Knowledge without infrastructure is suicidal. Then Vegapunk walks on stage and quietly becomes the scariest piece on the board. After O'Hara falls, he doesn't just pay respects and move on. He literally salvages their books from the lake, absorbs the entire archive, and uploads it into his brain and his island. Egghead is not just a lab, it's a data center. Vegapunk is walking cloud storage for the world's forbidden patch notes, Void Century research, ancient weapon theory, the real history of the world government. And because he's Vegapunk, he also has the tech to copy, compress, broadcast, and maybe even automate that knowledge. Now, compare that to Roger's era. Roger, through Odin, has access to the poneglyph network, a distributed, indestructible database carved into ancient stone. But he has no Vegapunk-level science, no global communications grid, no safe way to propagate the truth without triggering 1,000 Oharas at once. He can read the logs. He can laugh at Joy Boy's punchline. He cannot build a system that lets the world hear it without being instantly crushed. Listen to me. This is another layer of too early. It's not just Poseidon not born yet or Pluton still sealed. It's that the information infrastructure to handle the truth literally does not exist. Robin isn't there to decode on demand. Vegapunk isn't there to model consequences, to design dampers, to spread risk across the network instead of concentrating it in one doomed island. Luffy's era is the first time those pieces stack. You have Robin as the live interpreter of the poneglyph database. You have Vegapunk as the theoretical brain and technological amplifier. You have the Straw Hats and their alliances, Fishman Island, Wano, Alabasta, Dressrosa, the Revolutionary Army, as the social mesh that can actually receive and protect this data. When you line those panels up, you realize Oda has been quietly building a redundancy system. No more single point of failure like Ohara. And that's why Luffy can even be offered the same choice Roger turned down. Because this time, when someone reaches the final control node, the world might be able to survive knowing what it is. The real question is, who else has noticed that this data layer is finally online, and what are they already doing about it behind the scenes? Wano, Borders, Pluton, and the final calibration. So if the data layer is finally online, we need to talk about the country that's literally sitting on the hardware. Because Wano isn't just a cool samurai detour, it's the calibration screen for the entire system. Think about how Oda frames it. Wano is sealed off by walls of water, a vertical moat, weather armor plating the borders, centuries of isolation, a self-imposed firewall around a chunk of void century infrastructure. Odin is the one freak in that history who says, "Open it." He sails with Roger, he reads the ancient script, he walks on Laugh-Tale, he hears the same punchline that made Roger laugh. And he comes home with one clear instruction from that journey: these borders have to come down before the real show starts. Here's the thing, Odin fails. Publicly. Horrifically. The man who saw the One Piece, who literally carries Roger's updated patch notes in his head, dies in a boiling pot while the country doubles down on isolation. That's not just tragedy. That's Oda showing you the limit of Roger's generation in real time. Roger, through Odin, understands Wano's importance, understands that Pluton is parked there as a sealed weapon module, but he cannot live long enough or reshape Wano enough to see that prerequisite fulfilled. Too early for what? Listen to me. Too early to open Wano without triggering an immediate world-ending response. Too early to awaken Poseidon. Too early to have anyone crazy enough and beloved enough to topple a Yonko, ally with a shogun, and still walk away refusing the throne. Enter Luffy. The guy you keep insisting doesn't care about politics walks into the most politically loaded island in the story and accidentally does everything Odin's blueprint needed. He defeats Kaido, the external lock. He backs Momonosuke, the internal key. He rallies the scabbards, the living memory of Odin's will, and turns Wano from a closed trauma loop into an island that has publicly chosen a new dawn, even if the gates aren't literally open yet. And I say that with love. If you think Wano didn't matter, because Luffy didn't personally yell, "Open the borders right now," this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. When you line those panels up, Odin declaring the borders must open for Joy Boy, Toki's prophecy about 20 years, Kaido's fall, Momo standing over Onigashima and swearing to protect Wano until it's ready, you're watching the Roger blueprint move from design spec to implemented feature. Roger could only annotate the system. Wano must open. Pluton must be accessible. The world must be ready. Luffy actually starts flipping the switches that make that condition achievable without instant annihilation. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda keeps screaming it with fire festivals, dawn metaphors, and literal underground Pluton poneglyphs. So Wano is the divergence point. Roger tags the requirement. Luffy begins the rollout. The borders aren't open yet for a reason. The weapon is online, the controller isn't. Which raises a different question. Who else noticed that Pluton just moved from myth to reachable? And how fast are they racing Luffy to the final trigger? Gear 5 and Nika. The system finally boots up. And while everyone's scrambling for Pluton like it's a limited edition gacha pool, Oda just quietly flips the real switch on the rooftop of Onigashima, because we need to talk about the moment Luffy actually dies. Kaido doesn't just win that round. He deletes Luffy. Heart stops. Voice disappears. Observation users can't hear him. The narrator literally calls it a defeat. And then the drums start. That weird off-panel doom papa that every character reacts to before we even see the form. Listen to me. That's not just a cool sound effect. That's the system boot chime. You watch Luffy's body melt, his hair turn white, his eyes go all Looney Tunes, and reality itself starts rubberizing around him. He grabs lightning. He puppet strings Kaido through the ground. He laughs while his heartbeat sinks to the drums of liberation. The story straight up tells you this isn't Gear 4, this isn't a stat buff. This is the sun god Nika logging in. And then Oda rips the band-aid off the biggest fake out in the manga. That Gomu Gomu no Mi we've been joking about for 20 years. Actually the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika. A human fruit, a mythical model. A god of liberation whose whole thing is bending reality to make people smile. The world government has been hunting and suppressing this fruit for centuries, to the point that the Gorosei are talking about it like it's malware that keeps reinstalling itself on the world. Here's the thing, that's not just lore flavor, that's a login requirement. Joy Boy, in the ancient era, is the original Nika user account. He has full credentials to interface with this planetary weapon system we've been talking about. The One Piece network, the ancient weapons, the Void Century infrastructure. Roger reaches the same terminal at Laughtail, but without the credential. No Nika, no drums. He can read the documentation, laugh at the punchline, even update the poneglyph database through Odin. But he is functionally on a guest account, too early and read only. Luffy's awakening is that guest account finally being promoted to root. As Nika, he doesn't just punch harder. The story shows him warping the environment like it's rubber code. When you line those panels up with everything we know about the One Piece being a world editing system, the implication is brutal. This is the interface language. The fruit is the API key. So when Roger laughs at Laughtail, he's laughing at a script he can't execute. Luffy, as Nika, is going to arrive at the same place with the one thing Roger lacked, the ability to hit run and watch the world compile. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If you still think that leads to just a chest of treasure and a good joke, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because Luffy isn't just retracing Roger's route. He's doing it with admin privileges. Roger saw the blueprint. Luffy is the one who can finally turn that blueprint into executable code. Which raises an even uglier question. What does a guy who hates being a king do when the system hands him God mode? Imu and the Gorosei, the system's rootkit. So if Luffy is walking around with God mode potential, we need to talk about the people who already act like they own the console. Because the world of One Piece already has an admin. It already has a hand on the power button. Imu is not a theory. Imu is a silhouette on the empty throne, a crown where there should be a vacancy sign. You watch that scene in Marie-Joie, the supposedly symbolic seat of no one rules the world. And then this shadowy figure just strolls up, sits down, and the Gorosei kneel. That's not flavor. That's Oda quietly telling you, hey, there's a root user. Then you cut to Lulusia. A whole island, a whole piece of the map, erased from the sky by what looks suspiciously like a world-level weapon. You don't get that kind of delete key without access to the underlying system. Here's the thing. The Gorosei are not just evil old men with cool monster forms. They function like sysadmins for a corrupted OS. Whenever the Void Sentry peeks through, O'Hara's research, Clover's speech, Saul saving the books, they patch it out. They throttle information, they throttle history, they throttle people. Buster Call is just the visible part of the protocol. CPO, censorship, God's Knights. Those are diagnostics tools. Someone gets too close to the poneglyph network, you flag, you isolate, you wipe. When you line those panels up, O'Hara burning, Lulusia vanishing, Vegapunk being targeted, you're watching incident response in real time. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Roger was never in a position to fight that. Not because he was weak. Not because Prime Roger versus Emu is a bad power scaling matchup. But because structurally he had no leverage. No Poseidon awakened. Wano still closed. Pluton sealed. The Revolutionary Army doesn't exist. The Yonko balance hasn't formed. You don't storm the data center when you don't even know where the cables run. So he does the only thing that makes sense at that layer. He triggers a buffer overflow in society. He weaponizes the idea of treasure. He turns One Piece into malware for the world's imagination so that 1,000 pirate crews will DDoS the system over decades. Listen to me. That great pirate era is not a vibe. It's an exploit. Roger can't uninstall the rootkit, so he writes a script and schedules it to run later. Which is why Luffy versus Imu is not just final boss fight with a spooky immortal. It's user versus operating system. Luffy's whole story, refusing to be a hero, refusing to be a king, freeing Alabasta, Enies Lobby, Fishman Island, is him unintentionally stress testing every subsystem Emu relies on. Every island he breaks is another log entry in the error report. The Luffy-Roger blueprint isn't just a route to Laugh Tale. It's a plan to accumulate enough chaos and enough allies. Shirahoshi as Poseidon, Wano's borders opening, Sabo lighting the match on Reverie, to finally drag the rootkit into the light and rip it out. And I say that with love. If you think this ends with we beat the bad guy and go home, this is fine as a coping mechanism. But as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because once you rip out a rootkit, the system doesn't just go back to normal. You have to decide what boots up next. And the terrifying part is who's standing there when the loading screen appears. Why Roger stopped? Ethics, timing, or cowardice? So when that loading screen pops up, we hit the real Roger question. Why didn't he press start? Why walk up to the final control node of a world-scale weapon and then back away? You cannot just wave this off as he was too early and go back to your comfort fan art. We need to talk about what too early actually means in a story built on inherited will. There are three real options. 1. Roger couldn't activate it. 2. Roger wouldn't activate it. 3. He chose a sideways option and weaponized time instead. And I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Only the third one matches what he actually does on screen. First hypothesis. The technical lock. Roger reaches Laugh Tale, reads the ancient history, understands the system, but the components are missing. Poseidon hasn't even been born yet. Shirahoshi is centuries away. Wano is sealed. Pluton is boxed in the country Odin is begging to open. Uranus, whatever it is still off the board. When you line those panels up with Rayleigh telling the Straw Hats their journey mirrors the Roger Pirates, but the answers came too soon, you get a picture. Roger has the manual, but half the hardware isn't plugged in. Second hypothesis, the ethical lock. Here's the thing. If the One Piece is a reset mechanism, pushing it without prep is not a fun prank. It's mass casualty. You destroy the Red Line without moving Fishman Island. Everyone there dies. You flood coastlines without warning. Whole nations vanish. Roger is terminally ill, on a ticking clock, with no time to build alliances, evacuate islands, or even tell the world what's coming. He looks at a switch that can fix the Void Century's crime by replaying the catastrophe in real time. And he refuses. Not because he is weak, because he isn't a psychopath. Third hypothesis, the workaround. This is the one Oda actually animates. Roger walks off Laughtail, laughs, and instead of declaring war on the world government, he declares an era. He turns himself in. He uses his execution as a broadcast to seed a generation of monsters, dreamers, and future allies. That is not procrastination. That is him saying, I can't do the reset safely, so I will manufacture someone who can. And I say that with love. If you think he just wanted someone else to enjoy the joke, this is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Now contrast that with Luffy. Luffy has time, years of liberating islands, tearing down symbols, making Fishman Island his territory, inspiring a fleet, making friends out of former enemies. He is building the evacuation plan Roger never had. Roger gets a few rushed conversations with Whitebeard and Odin. Luffy gets an entire era staring at him, waiting. So the blueprint is the same. The route is the same. But the decision at Laughtail? That's where Roger and Luffy are designed to diverge. The question is not, will Luffy find the treasure? The question is, will he dare to flip the switch Roger walked away from? And what has he built so the world survives it? And if you think that's dramatic, wait until we line up their journeys beat for beat. Luffy's corrections, fixing Roger's blind spots. One arc at a time. So when you line those panels up, it stops looking like Luffy is Roger 2.0 and starts looking like Luffy is the software patch the system has been waiting for. He's not just walking the route, he's debugging it. Here's the thing, go back to Skypiea. Roger hears the bell. Luffy rings it. That's not a cute echo, that's amplification. Roger leaves a private graffiti note in Shandora. Luffy literally weaponizes sound, broadcasts that ancient message down to the blue sea, and tells the Sky People and the Shandians, your history mattered. One man reads the database. The other one hits send, then Fishman Island. Roger visits, learns about Poseidon, and walks away because the mermaid princess of his era isn't awakened. Luffy shows up and, without knowing a single line of the blueprint, swears his protection to Shirahoshi, the literal living weapon Roger was missing. He doesn't say, I will use you in the final war. He says, you're my friend, I'll punch whoever scares you. That's a different operating system for the same weapon. Jump to Wano. Roger reaches a closed country and accepts that Pluton stays buried. Luffy walks into the same isolationist fortress and burns the problem down from the inside. He doesn't just topple Kaido, he hands Momo the agency to choose whether those borders open. Roger respects the lock. Luffy manufactures a world where the lock's owner can finally turn the key. And Sabaody? I need you to be very honest with me for a second. The Celestial Dragon Punch is not just a cool panel you repost for clout. It is Roger's quiet resentment made explicit. Previous generations grumbled about the dragons. Luffy walks into the slave auction, sees the system naked, and throws the first real punch of the coming war directly into the face of the world nobles. That's escalation. That's the era Roger started finally cashing in. Now look at who he's doing this with. Vivi in Alabaster, Shirahoshi in Fishman Island, Momo in Wano, Law from North Blue, the minks on Zoo, giants, toys, literally a walking ship soul. Roger had legends on his crew, but his coalition is basically strong pirates and one historian. Luffy is building a distributed alliance that maps onto every oppressed node of this system. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial to pretend that's accidental. Because Luffy is not reading the Void Century patch notes. He doesn't know about final control nodes or planetary reset levers. He just keeps doing the one thing the system needs at each stop. Protect Poseidon. Free Wano. Expose the celestial dragons. Not because he is smarter than Roger, not because I am smarter than you, but because the will of D in this story behaves like guidance, not just inheritance. Listen to me. Oda is not showing you parallels for nostalgia. He is showing you upgrades. Every time Luffy echoes Roger, something is corrected, completed, or scaled up. That's the functional blueprint. And we haven't even hit Laugh Tale yet. So if this is what he's fixing on the way, what happens when he finally reaches the switch Roger refused to flip? The emotional cost, turning a beloved adventure into a tragedy. So here's the thing. Once you ask, what happens when he reaches the switch Roger refused to flip? You run straight into something most of us don't actually want to look at. Because if this blueprint reading is even close to right, then the story you've been using as a comfort show. The goofy pirate anime you throw on to feel better after work. That is a 25-year slow march toward an intentional apocalypse. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. How many times have you said, One Piece is my safe place? You rewatch East Blue, you bask in the orange sunset over the Going Merry, you quote, I want to live, like it's therapy. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Oda has been telling you, in plain panels, that the Void Sentry ends in a world-scale weapon firing and the current age dying. And when you line those panels up, even the early whimsy starts to feel different. East Blue's clown pirates and dog guarding a pet shop. That's not just silliness, that's narrative anesthesia. You're being eased into a world that is structurally broken, where genocide is baked into the map. Skypiea, which everyone wrote off for years as filler island in the sky, is literally a prototype. A lost ancient city, a poneglyph, a beam weapon pointed at the earth, and a bell that rings across the world like a test ping through the system. Listen to me. Luffy's stupidity, the meat obsession, the I'll just punch God, all of that plays as comedy because it has to. If you actually sat with the idea that this rubber idiot is walking toward a console that can erase continents, you wouldn't sleep. So the story makes you laugh. The same way Roger laughed. We need to talk about that laugh. Roger reaches Laugh Tale, reads the true history, sees the shape of Joy Boy's weaponized treasure. And what does he do? He laughs until he cries. Fandom turns that into, haha, it was a gag. But think about the tragedy there. A man who sees the whole world, loves it anyway, and chooses to die smiling instead of pulling the trigger too early. He doesn't break the world. He lets it keep limping along, knowing it's condemned. Now put Luffy in that frame. This is the guy who throws himself at Enies' lobby to save one friend, who declares war on the world government by burning a flag, because Robin cried. What does it do to him to realize that protecting his friends, long-term, might mean destroying the entire current world so the next one can live? Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is crueler than you want to admit. That is where this blueprint points. And I say that with love. If you really love One Piece, you have to hold both pieces at once. The joy and the horror. The found family dinners on the Sunny, and the fact that those dinners are happening on a sinking ship called the present age. Don't run from that tension. Sit in it. Because only when you feel how much there is to lose does Luffy's final choice actually mean anything. And if the emotional cost is that high, then we need to ask an even worse question. What kind of person does the story have to turn Luffy into by the end to make him capable of choosing at all? Mini roadmap. Where this blueprint takes us next. So, if the story has to reforge Luffy just to let him stand in that final room, we need to talk about where this blueprint is actually dragging us next. Because at this point, you're not just watching a goofy pirate adventure, you're watching a pre-written route execute itself in real time. Quick recap, so your brain has the save file loaded. Luffy and Roger are not similar guys with similar vibes. They're two halves of a designed route. Roger is the test run that mapped the course, laughed at the punchline, and walked away. Luffy is the live run that has to actually press the button. The One Piece is not a chest, it's the trigger node of a world-scale weaponized system. Joy Boy, the ancient weapons, the Void Century history. Those are subsystems and permissions, not flavor text. So what's left on this route? Egghead, Elbaf, and the final C. On Egghead, Oda is literally dumping the operating manual in your lap through Vegapunk, stress testing the world reset idea against the Buster Call and the Gorosei. In Elbaf, we're heading straight into the ancient library that Usopp/Norland lies, and probably a direct echo of whatever giant context Roger had that we've only seen in crumbs. After that, we hit the real endgame, Laugh Tale 2.0, but this time with the system bootable. Here's the thing, I'm going to walk you through how Oda is setting up final era parallels shot for shot, the government's siege on Egghead as a cleaner, more desperate version of God Valley, Elbaf as the mythic last big ally arc. Roger never got to fully lock in. The inevitable world broadcast as a mirror to Roger's execution, but with Luffy forcing the world to watch the decision instead of the death. Visually, structurally, Oda loves echoing himself. When you line those panels up, the climax stops being mysterious and starts being constrained. And we are absolutely not done with characters as blueprint components. Blackbeard is the corrupted D, the guy who looks at the same system and chooses maximum exploitation over liberation. Dragon is the revolutionary variable, the one trying to topple the world without the weapon, which tells you something about what he thinks that weapon does. Shanks is the throttle, the man who has been pacing the era and is running out of runway for his final move. And Robin is the manual reader. She's the only person in the story who can literally look at the global hard drive and say, here is what this button does. Now, I need you to be very honest with me for a second. You might be thinking, isn't this overthinking it? What if Oda just swerves in its vibes? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda keeps handing us explicit Void Century weapon foreshadowing and you're calling it a cute backdrop. We're going to address that pushback head on, with panels, with timelines, with what Oda himself has said about planning. And promise, we're staying fast and concrete. No 12-layer galaxy brain where the One Piece is secretly friendship. We're only following the blueprint where it already points. Canon, parallels, author habits. Next, we start plugging specific Roger Luffy scenes into this route and watch the future snap into place, right up until the moment the blueprint itself breaks. Blackbeard, the failed D and mirror of Luffy/Roger. And if you're tracing a blueprint, you also have to look at the misprint, the version that runs the same code but outputs horror. So we need to talk about Marshall D. Teach. Here's the thing. Blackbeard is not a random mid-boss who wandered in from a different manga. Oda builds him like a control experiment. Same initial conditions as Luffy and Roger. Same letter, completely different result. When you line those panels up, it's actually disgusting how clean the inversion is. Look at his trajectory. Patient nobody on Whitebeard's crew, literally hiding in the background for decades because he's waiting for one specific devil fruit. He smiles, he drinks, he plays the goofy uncle, and then the second Thatch finds the yummy no me. Murder. No duel, no honor, just an opportunistic throat cut and a stolen power. From there it's impelled down, Marineford, and the moment he drapes that black curtain over Whitebeard's corpse and rips a second fruit out of the system like he's hot-wiring a weaponized server rack. That's the dark version of inherited will. Luffy and Roger collect people. Teach collects devil fruits. They both have huge dreams, refuse to submit, laugh in the face of the correct world order. Teach literally tells Luffy on Jaya that people's dreams never end. Same line, same romantic language. But where Luffy hears freedom for everyone, Blackbeard hears permission structure for me to do anything. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If you still read the D as a pure secret hero bloodline, this is fine as a coping mechanism. But as actual story analysis, it's denial. Blackbeard is Oda walking into the room, flipping on the lights and going, no, this trait is morally neutral. Watch what happens when the wrong guy gets the keys. Because in this model, the One Piece is not just treasure, it's a system trigger. A final control node tying together ancient weapons, void century tech, the whole buried network. Luffy represents the user who would either break the switch or use it to flatten hierarchy. Blackbeard is the nightmare QA test, the D who would absolutely press every button at once just to see which genocide pops first. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda is very loud. You can already see the fork. Roger reaches Laugh Tale, reads the history, and walks away without activating anything. Blackbeard is built as the guy who, if he got there first, would not hesitate. He would weaponize the sea, the sky, the map itself, and call it freedom because he's the one standing on top. So when we talk about the final clash between Luffy and Blackbeard, it's not just Pirate King branding, it's two DS fighting over the operating system of the planet. Who gets to decide what the next 800 years look like? And Oda is very quietly telling you why the blueprint needs Luffy specifically, not just anyone who can smile on the execution stand. Which brings us back to Roger, the original non-user of the system. If Blackbeard is the corrupted D and Luffy is the corrective, then Roger is the hinge between them. The guy who saw both futures and gambled on one kid. So next, we're going to track how Oda stages that gamble in the text, scene by scene, until the chosen successor stops feeling mystical and starts feeling terrifyingly logical. Dragon and the Revolution, Roger's era without the blueprint. And here's where that gamble gets messy. Because while Roger is out here seeding a future pirate king, there's another player trying to rewrite the world without ever touching Laugh Tale, Monkey D. Dragon. We need to talk about what Dragon is actually doing, not the meme version where he's that guy who shows up in Loguetown once and then vibes in the rain. His stated mission is brutally clear: overthrow the world government, liberate oppressed nations, and drag the system's cruelty into the sunlight from the ground up. He's not chasing treasure. He's dismantling an operating system with nothing but people power and propaganda. And the irony, listen to me, is insane. Dragon is Luffy's father and Garp's son. He's literally sitting at the intersection of D-will, marine justice, and revolutionary action. Garp believes in individual heroism inside the system. Dragon believes the system itself is the problem. Luffy is the one who might end up with the literal root access key from the void century. 3 generations, 3 answers to the same question. How do you stop this ancient machine from eating people? Here's the thing. Dragon's movement is what fixing the world looks like when you don't have the Laugh Tale blueprint. You free one kingdom, you topple one tyrant, you expose one celestial dragon atrocity. It's necessary, it's heroic. It is also, structurally, surface-level regime change. You're swapping out admins, while the core weaponized architecture, the Red Line, Mariejois, the ancient weapons protocol, stays humming in the background. When you line those panels up, it gets bleak. The Revolutionary Army helps kingdoms like Lulusia stand up. The world government responds with an erasure beam from the sky that looks suspiciously like Uranus. That's Oda showing you the power gap between we have passionate insurgents and we control the system that rewrites geography. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. If Luffy never touches the One Piece system, what happens to Dragon's dream? At best, he builds a slightly less monstrous version of the same world, always one secret weapon away from annihilation. At worst, he's a tutorial boss for Imu's real power. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because Oda keeps staging the contrast. Dragon moves in shadows, sabotaging conferences, flipping kingdoms. Luffy walks into the Holy Land, punches a celestial dragon proxy, and accidentally declares war on the entire world structure without even knowing what the Void Century is. So Luffy's eventual activation of the One Piece system becomes the fork in the road. Either he coordinates with Dragon's revolution and completes it, using the control node to make their wins permanent, or he renders it obsolete overnight by deleting the board they were playing on. Pirate era change versus revolutionary change. One plays with the pieces, one rewrites the rules, and all of that traces back to Roger starting the Great Pirate Era. His non-use of the system didn't just create Luffy. It created Dragon's parallel attempt, Blackbeard's corrupted attempt, every Yonko reshuffling the map, multiple routes, one hidden blueprint. Next, we're going to track how Oda quietly positions Luffy's route as the only one that actually reaches the route system, and why that should scare you more than any Buster Call. Elbaf, Giants, and the last missing parallels. So if Luffy is the only one actually reaching the route system, we need to talk about the island that's been sitting in the background like Chekhov's protein shake, Elbaf. Here's the thing. Elbaf is not just Usopp gets his moment and ha 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 big Viking memes. This is the island Oda has dangled in front of you since Little Garden, tied to giants, honor, and the one straw hat whose dream is literally become a brave warrior of the sea because of stories from Elbaf. You are not getting that payoff in the final saga without it being structurally crucial to the One Piece system. What do we actually know? Giants. A warrior culture that worships the sun. Usopp's obsession. Saul, the Ohara giant who should be dead, walking around in a coat of bandages on a winter island full of books. Robin's reveal that the Ohara library didn't burn. It migrated, rescued by giants who then report to Elbaf. When you line those panels up, Elbaf is screaming Void Century Archive and last big lore dump in a very unsubtle way. So I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Do you really think Roger's crew went around reading world-changing stone USB sticks and just never met a single giant scholar or warrior? This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Oda has had giants sprinkled everywhere. Marineford, Eni's lobby, Big Mom's backstory, while carefully never letting us actually go to their homeland. That's a withheld set piece. That's a missing hub. Elbaf, in blueprint terms, is the final information and alliance node. For Roger, those connections are off-screen. For Luffy, we're going to watch him walk in the front door. Expect ancient texts that survived Ohara. Expect elders who remember that laughing brat with the mustache and the day he showed up asking about the same weaponized system. Not because I am smarter than you, but because Oda literally had Rayleigh say their routes are almost identical while refusing to spoil the answers. Listen to me. Elbaf is where the parallels go from cute to terrifying. Luffy meets people who knew Roger. He hears new stories about why Roger laughed at Laughtail, what choices he didn't make, what world he refused to overwrite. And in that same breath, the giants lay out the scale of what pressing that final button actually does to continents, to seas, to entire species. And here's the twist. I think Elbaf is also going to hand Luffy something Roger never had, tech or lore about the original world configuration before the Red Line, before the fracture. Giant engineering, sun worship, tied back to the ancient kingdom, maybe even hardware fragments that explain how the system was built, not just what it does. Roger understood the system's outcome. Luffy is on track to understand its architecture. That's why Elbaf feels like the blueprint's final calibration pass. After that island, there shouldn't be any major conceptual unknowns left between Luffy and the decision Roger walked away from. The only remaining variable will be Luffy himself. And if that sounds comforting to you, wait until we talk about his actual dream and why that might be the most dangerous input the system has ever seen. What happens when Luffy reaches Laughtail for real this time? So let's stop hovering at the edge of the map and actually walk onto the island. You've been running this story in your head for 20 years. I need you to be very honest with me for a second about what you're picturing when the Sunny crests that last wave. You're seeing Roger's scene, right? Same shot, same laughter, just HD and color corrected. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. Because Oda is absolutely going to mirror that arrival, and then he's going to break the mirror. Here's the thing. The Straw Hats are going to reach Laughtail, in-universe, along Roger's route. Rayleigh already told you that. They read the final poneglyphs. They see the full Void Century history. They understand the weapon system wired into the planet. We'll get panels that rhyme with the Roger flashback. The wide eyes, the stunned silence, the beat of incomprehension, and then the laugh. The same stupid, uncontrollable, shoulder-shaking laugh Roger and his crew had. But the crucial difference is what comes after the laughing. Roger saw the punchline and walked away. Luffy is going to see the same horror, the same ridiculousness, and then say the part Roger never could, his dream, out loud, as an answer. Not just "this is funny," but "this is what I'm going to do with it." When you line those panels up with the earlier, "I want to tell you my dream" scene, that's the completion of the circuit. Listen to me. That dream is not a birthday wish, it is a policy decision. Luffy will stand at the final control node of the One Piece system and choose to flip it on. Destroy the red line, unify the seas, move Fishman Island, trigger earthquakes, sea level shifts, political collapse. He will knowingly press the button that guarantees suffering in the short term because the alternative is leaving the world locked in an ancient cage forever. And the crew? We already know the beats. Shock first. Nami, the navigator who's mapped this broken ocean her whole life, realizing the map itself is about to be deleted. Usopp, the coward, immediately imagining everyone who dies when the sea goes wild. Robin, who finally found the truth of history, having to accept that preserving it might mean weaponizing it. Frankie thinking about Pluton. Jinbei thinking about Fishman Island. Sanji thinking about the all-blue literally being born in front of him. Fear, then alignment. Because this is the social architecture Roger started. A captain insane enough to shoulder the sin, and a crew who choose to stand behind him anyway. Not because he's a king, because they know exactly what he's doing and they agree. And that's where the blueprint cashes out. Every parallel, every echo, converges here. Luffy doing the one thing Roger could not bring himself, or was not allowed to do. The question is not, will he push the button? The question is what he breaks after he does. From Easter eggs to engineering, what you've actually been watching. So let's zoom out for a second, because what you've actually been watching this whole time is way dumber and way smarter than Luffy is just like Roger. We started this video by bullying, gently, the comfy take that these are just parallels. Same hat, same smile, inherited will, end of analysis. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. We walked it all the way up into a full machine. Joy Boy's ancient project, the Void Century blackout, the three weapons as hardware, Laugh Tale as the control room, and the One Piece as the master switch tying it all together. Here's the thing. Once you see that scaffold, the Luffy-Roger stuff stops being cute and starts being architecture. Oda didn't just make Luffy like Roger. He wrote one story split across two eras. Roger is the diagnostic run. Luffy is the final execution. Same route, same database, different world state, and a captain who refuses to sit on a throne even when the entire story is hand-delivering him a crown. And Oda is not hiding this in tinfoil. Rayleigh literally looks you in the eyes at Sabaody and says, "Yeah, your journey is basically ours. I could tell you the history, but that would ruin the story." When you line those panels up with Oden's flashback, the same islands, the same poneglyph trail, you see a dev going, "We tested the system once. We're running it again with updated variables." Fishman Island prophecy? That's not soft fantasy flavor. That's a scheduled system event. A man with a straw hat will bring the dawn and move this entire island to the surface. Whitebeard's speech at Marineford, screaming that someone will come who carries centuries of history on his back. That's a patch note. Gear 5's Nika reveal turns Luffy into Joy Boy's literal interface. Imu erasing Lulusia from the map is your demo of what Uranus and the network can actually do when someone ruthless holds the keys. I need you to be very honest with me for a second. That reading hurts. It takes this warm, adventurous pirate fantasy and exposes the bones, genocide, engineered cataclysms, an ancient weaponized ocean, and a protagonist whose dream might be pressing execute on a necessary apocalypse. We love this world. The idea that the dawn might require cracking it open like an egg is horrifying. But that's exactly why it works. If the system is that monstrous, then Luffy choosing what to do with it actually means something. The dawn isn't just vibes. It's the ethical outcome of a boy who hates control being handed the ultimate control panel. The more terrifying the blueprint, the more profound it is when he says, in action, "I'm not your king." So here's my invitation. Not because I'm smarter than you, but because my brain is broken in a very specific, pattern-seeking way. Go back. Rewatch Loguetown, Skypiea, Water 7, Sabaody, Fishman Island, Zoo, Wano. Treat every Roger echo, every poneglyph, every prophecy as a line of code in the same program. You don't have to buy every speculation we've made. Take it as an experiment. What happens if you assume Oda is using parallels as engineering, not aesthetics? Because once you do that, one last uncomfortable question shows up. If this is a system, who else is trying to log in? Your turn. Choosing between comfy copium and canon chaos. Because once you do that, one last uncomfortable question shows up. If this is a system, who else is trying to log in? Here's the thing. You've just watched me stack Luffy Roger echoes like a conspiracy corkboard. You've seen the routes, the laughs, the weapons, the void century breadcrumbs. So I need you to be very honest with me for a second. Are you really going back to, aye, they're just similar guys, funny hats, same vibe? After you've watched Oda literally mirror Loguetown storms, Skypiea bells, Sabaody slave auctions, Fishman Island prophecies, Wano borders, egghead satellites. If you want the comfy reading, I'm not taking it away from you. Luffy is just Roger but freer. The One Piece is just treasure. The system stuff is overthinking. This is fine as a coping mechanism, but as actual story analysis, it's denial. So defend it. In the comments, I want you to bring me canon. Quote, panels, sight scenes. Make the case that all this blueprint scaffolding is just Oda doodling. And if you're on the chaos side with me, listen to me. Don't just clap and type peak. If you think Luffy is walking a route Roger deliberately left behind, then upgrade the theory. Drop the parallels I missed, the crewmate reactions that rhyme with the Roger pirates, the way Rayleigh frames their journey as almost identical but refuses to say the punchline. The tiny egghead lines that feel like someone else trying to seize the same weaponized system first. When you line those panels up, this stops being headcanon and starts looking like Oda's actual outline. Also, I'm assigning homework. Yes, you. Rewatch Loguetown, Skypiea, Sabaody, Fishman Island, Wano, and Egghead with a notebook. Literally write Luffy on one side, Roger/Joyboy/system on the other, and every time you see an echo, storm over the execution platform, bell over the ancient city, slaves freed under a mangrove, fishermen talking about the sun, borders and Pluton, satellites screaming about the future, log it. Treat the story like a lab experiment, not a vibes compilation. And I say that with love, because I am also the gremlin pausing weekly chapters to squint at background rocks. I'm not asking you to become me. I'm asking you to take Oda seriously. Not because I am smarter than you, but because the man has been quietly writing one giant Roger Luffy, two-part tragedy to comedy for 25 years, and we keep flattening it into, will he get the bag? So here's your call to action. Drop a comment taking a side. Comfy copium or canon chaos, but back it up. Then send this to that one friend who still swears the One Piece is just treasure as a friendly intervention. Whether you're clinging to the comfy version or diving into the system horror with me, you're in the same crew. You're treating this piece, this history, this ancient weapon of a story like it matters. And that, more than anything on Laugh Tale, is the inherited will of this fandom.